Welcome to your medieval city adventure, an experience that begins the very moment you step past the creaking wooden gate and immediately question every life choice that delivered you here. The good news, the city is lively. The bad news, so is everything else. Before you even have time to adjust your cloak or pretend you're blending in, the place hits you with a wall of sensation strong enough to knock the optimism out of your lungs. You didn't enter aboard a city. You entered a bacteria convention, complete with noise, filth, and aromas that could file for assault charges. Before we step inside the crowded, plague-stricken streets of a medieval city, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time of day you're hearing this story of survival. Now let's begin. The first thing you notice isn't the people, it's the smell. It ambushes you before your eyes finish blinking. Imagine a blend of smoke, sweat, animal droppings, fish that didn't make it to lunchtime, and chamber pots enthusiastically emptied into the street. Now imagine that aroma baking gently under the sun and recycling itself from building to building like a communal curse. That's your welcome package. You inhale once, cough twice, and suddenly the countryside you left behind feels like a lost paradise where the air didn't physically argue with you. But never mind the smells. There's no time to recover. The noise comes next. Cities were loud, as in, is everyone shouting because they're angry? Or is this just how humans communicate now? Kind of loud blacksmith's hammer iron like they're trying to win a competition. Traders scream prices as if volume alone determines value. Children run between your legs. Goats bleat from rooftops for reasons no historian can adequately explain. And somewhere a dog is barking like it owes someone money. This isn't the gentle hum of urban life. This is chaos rehearsing for a performance. And then there's the crowd. You thought city meant a place with many people. You were wrong. It meant all the people. Everyone who has ever lived. Or at least everyone currently trying to shoulder past you on their way to something urgent. You can't move without brushing elbows, cloaks, baskets of onions, or the occasional chicken someone swears is under control. Medieval cities didn't have streets so much as narrow channels that humans, animals, carts and fate were funneled through, often at once. If personal space were a religion, this city would be a godless land. Navigating these streets is its own adventure. The roads are uneven, shaped less by design and more by centuries of footsteps, cartwheels and nature's general disrespect for your ankles. The mud is deep enough in some stretches to require emotional support, especially since the water used to thin it out isn't rainwater. Let's put it that way. Every step is a gamble, and every gamble is a fresh opportunity to discover what has recently been dumped from an upper floor window. The medieval city street is not your friend, it may not even be neutral. Look up, and you'll see something equally startling. Buildings leaning inward over the street like gossiping neighbours sharing secrets. They weren't built this way for charm, they simply grew crooked over time, as if the city itself were shrugging perpetually. Upper floors practically touch each other, creating long stretches of shadow where sunlight hesitates to enter, as if even the sun worries about catching something down here. And the people, you are now part of them whether you like it or not. City folk move with purpose and fast. They weave around you with the skill of dancers and the personal warmth of cold porridge. You're in their way. Everyone is in everyone's way. That's simply how a medieval city breathes. Rapidly, inefficiently, and with a mild sense of panic. The pressure of humanity is constant. You feel it in the shove of a passing carpenter, the bump of a wool merchant's basket, and the apologetic nod from someone carrying 3 geese and making no effort to alter their trajectory. But perhaps the most important detail isn't what you see, it's what you immediately realise. Cities were alive, not metaphorically. They pulsed with human bodies, animal bodies, fumes, heat, noise, and the constant scraping, clanging, stomping rhythm of existence. Every inch of this place is a collaboration between people and problems, and you, newcomer, have just stepped into the orchestra pit. By the time you reach your lodging, or the nearest corner where you can stop and regret things in peace, you've learned the #1 rule of medieval urban survival, The city will not adjust to you. You must adjust to the city. You must accept the smells, the pressure, the crowdedness, the lingering question of what just brushed your leg, and the uncomfortable truth that fresh air is no longer part of your daily experience. You came here for opportunity, for excitement, maybe even for a better life. Instead, you've arrived in a place where the air fights back. The streets argue with you. And every step is a reminder that medieval city living was less about thriving and more about hoping you make it to nightfall. Welcome to the city. You've already made a mistake. And the city hasn't even tried to kill you yet. That part comes later. If you thought the medieval city merely looked dirty, wait until you learn what clean meant to the people living there. To modern ears, clean implies things like fresh water, soap that doesn't double as sandpaper, and perhaps a shower that doesn't involve moral compromise. But in a medieval city, cleanliness existed, just not competitively. It wasn't a goal, it was more of a rumour. So let's begin with bathing, because medieval people did occasionally wash themselves, just not with any consistency and not with any urgency. Bathhouses existed throughout Europe, though whether you'd want to set foot in one depends on how strongly you value your immune system. Many were communal, many were steamy, and many hosted combinations of activities so diverse that calling them spas would be both accurate and deeply misleading. You might take a bath, talk business, eat a snack, and witness someone receiving a service that would absolutely void the bathhouse's health inspection score, if such inspections existed. Baths were typically taken in large wooden tubs filled with water that was heated once, used by several people in succession, and changed only when it achieved a texture not legally permitted in 12 countries today. Someone might assure you the water was fresh, but remember, fresh was a relative term. If it only had a few bits floating in it, that qualified as clean enough. For those who didn't frequent bathhouses, washing at home was, well, it happened sometimes. A basin, a small cloth, and the hope that nobody smelled you before you finished. People might rinse their hands, faces, and occasionally their feet. But a full-body wash, that was a seasonal event, something that might coincide with a festival or a sudden desire to impress a neighbour. Bathing was less about hygiene and more about morale. Too much bathing, in fact, was considered suspicious. Doctors genuinely believed hot water could open pores and invite disease in, which is historically ironic because disease was already in, around, above, and occasionally waving hello from the rafters. Clothing played a major role in the medieval concept of cleanliness. Wearing a clean shirt was considered more important than washing the body underneath it. Laundry happened more frequently than bathing, which created the fascinating effect of people looking cleaner than they actually were. Medieval society embraced the idea that if it looked clean, that counted. A fresh linen shirt was essentially deodorant with sleeves. But the biggest hurdle in achieving cleanliness wasn't personal habits, it was the city itself. To describe medieval streets as dirty is like describing the plague as a mild inconvenience. Streets acted as the sewer system, the trash can, and the communal dumping ground for anyone whose chamber pot was too full and whose patience was too thin. Waste flowed freely, though flowed implies direction. Much of it just waited patiently for someone's shoe to discover it. Residents swept their doorsteps, but sweeping just meant pushing the mess a little further out, preferably into a neighbour's area. Cleanliness was a competitive sport only in the sense that everyone competed to make the streets slightly less their problem. Then there's shared spaces, perhaps the medieval city's greatest challenge to cleanliness. Lanes were cramped and tight, but markets were even tighter, packed with stalls displaying fish, cheese, meat, and vegetables in varying states of edible confidence. Food hygiene laws were more like polite suggestions. You could buy a fish in the morning and have it fully introduce itself to your nostrils by afternoon. The communal well was another point of shared danger. People drew drinking water from the same bucket horses drank from, children played near, and occasionally someone's accident fell into. If a well was convenient, people used it. If it was contaminated, people still used it, just with extra hope. Public latrines did exist, but they were the medieval equivalent of enter at your own risk. They were often dark, crowded, and built over pits that defied both description and the known laws of physics. Some cities built latrines over rivers, which sounds clever, till you remember that people downstream also existed. Medieval cleanliness, in short, was a collaborative effort to remain tolerably unclean without tipping into chaos. The average person developed extraordinary tolerance for grime simply because they had to. Smells faded into background noise. Dirt became part of the scenery. If someone washed too often, people whispered. If someone smelled too much, people shrugged. Cleanliness wasn't a lifestyle. It was a brief moment you achieved before stepping outside and losing the achievement instantly. And yet this system worked. Sort of. People survived. Children grew up. Markets thrived. Life continued despite the fact that bacteria viewed medieval cities as retirement resorts. The medieval definition of clean wasn't wrong by their standards. It was simply adapted to their reality, a world where filth couldn't be conquered, only negotiated with. So lower your expectations. A medieval city could be many things, bustling, vibrant, noisy, alive, but clean? That was never on the brochure. If you're thirsty in a medieval city, congratulations, you now face a decision more dangerous than most sword fights. Water should be a source of life, hydration, and maybe even spiritual clarity. In a medieval city, it was a roulette wheel, with a 50-50 chance of providing refreshment or launching a personal medical crisis. Water didn't refresh you, it challenged your immune system like a liquid dare. Let's start with wells, the pride of many communities. Wells were freshly dug, carefully maintained, at least in theory, and deeply believed to be safe. But here's the problem. Medieval urban planning didn't exactly prioritise separating drinking water from anything else. Wells sat in courtyards, marketplaces, and winding alleys, often just a few steps away from where animals wandered, where laundry was rinsed, or where yesterday's accidents were poured without ceremony. A well might be the community's most prized feature, but it was also exposed to every questionable decision made within a 10-metre radius. The water bucket itself was its own germ festival. Everyone used it, everyone touched it. Sometimes people even rinsed their hands in it before lowering it back down the shaft, because why not combine sanitation with contamination? When the rope became frayed, fibres drifted into the water. When the bucket cracked, wood chips seasoned your beverage. A medieval well was less a water source and more a broth that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Then there were rivers, which medieval people viewed with optimism bordering on delusion. A river is flowing water, they thought. Flowing water cleans itself, they insisted. Flowing water doesn't clean itself. It simply moves the problem downstream, where you might be standing, enthusiastically filling your jug. Cities used rivers for everything: washing clothes, dumping waste, watering livestock, disposing of things that needed to disappear quickly, and occasionally disposing of things they hoped nobody would ever ask about again. If you're picturing a serene, sparkling river like in fantasy illustrations, stop immediately. Medieval rivers weren't blue, they weren't green, they were opaque, and yet people drank from them every single day. It wasn't ignorance exactly, it was necessity. Water was water. Boiling took fuel, time, and pots big enough to matter. If you were poor, and most people were, you didn't have the luxury to treat water like a scientific hazard. You treated it like a chore. Drink, hope, repeat. The urban runoff problem also deserves attention. Whenever it rained, and sometimes even when it didn't, water washed through the streets, picking up everything in its path. Mud, ash, discarded food, stray feathers, pieces of wood, and substances we'll very politely call mystery materials. This delightful mixture flowed into gutters, then into rivers, which then flowed right back into buckets of unsuspecting citizens. The cycle of life, medieval edition. Contamination wasn't always visible either. A well might look crystal clear, shimmering even, while quietly harbouring a microscopic army waiting to wage gastrointestinal warfare. Medieval citizens did not have microscopes. They had guesswork. And guesswork is not a science known for its consistent accuracy. Some cities built cisterns to catch and store rainwater. In theory, this was brilliant. In practice, Cisterns were often shared by the community, uncovered and vulnerable to anything that could fall inside. Leaves, insects, dirt, animals, lost objects, childhood toys. If gravity wanted it, the cistern accepted it. The water sat there, steeping like medieval tea. Even when city authorities attempted to improve water quality, their methods were creative. Some used herbs to purify wells. Some dropped in stones believed to repel evil spirits. Some installed wooden covers to protect wells from debris, which unfortunately also protected bacteria from sunlight. Good intentions, questionable outcomes. And then there was the social side of water. Fetching it was an event. People gathered around wells not just for hydration, but for gossip, shouting, arguing, courting, or ignoring one another dramatically. It was a communal ritual where everyone contributed, willingly or unwillingly, to the well's ever-changing flavour profile. A bucket full of well water wasn't just a drink. It was a blend of your neighbour's life choices. Because water was so risky, many medieval people drank ale, beer, or weak wine instead. It wasn't because they wanted to live in a state of permanent tipsiness, though that sometimes happened. It was because fermentation killed enough harmful organisms to make the drink safer than water. Imagine living in a world where beer is the responsible choice. Of course, not everyone had access to alcohol all the time. Children drank watered-down ale. Workers drank small beer. The poor drank water with the same expression modern people reserve for opening suspicious emails. The stomach was a survival champion because it had to be. You didn't build immunity in a medieval city. You constructed it brick by brick, one questionable sip at a time. Despite all of this, people carried on. They drank their well water, their river water, their storage water. They survived, mostly. They learned which sources were reliable, which neighbourhoods had better tasting water, a relative concept, and which wells should only be used if you were preparing to meet your ancestors. Water was hope with a side of dysentery, a risk assessed daily, accepted cheerfully and regretted silently. And tomorrow you'll drink it again. If water was a gamble in a medieval city, then food was the talent show audition, where every ingredient walked on stage asking, "Are you feeling lucky?" Eating during a plague wasn't simply about fueling your body, it was about negotiating with it. Food didn't nourish you, it tested your optimism. Every meal was a small leap of faith, and sometimes those leaps landed you in bed regretting every decision since sunrise. Let's start with what food even reached the city during a plague outbreak. Trade slowed to a crawl because merchants, being human, also preferred not to die. Farms outside the walls suffered from labour shortages, abandoned fields, or frightened peasants refusing to approach city gates. The result? Fewer carts arriving with fresh produce, grain and livestock. Markets still opened, but the number of stalls dropped. Where once you had choices, now you had hopes. And hope isn't edible. Inside the city, preservation was a survival strategy, though the methods ranged from ingenious to please don't think too hard about it. Salting was the gold standard, especially for fish and meat. The more salt you used, the longer it kept, but the harder it became to chew. Salted meat could reach a texture that tested not only your jaw strength, but your will to continue existing. People soaked it in water to soften it, a process which helped somewhere between slightly and barely. Smoking and drying were also common methods. Smoked fish hung in market stalls looking like they'd been rescued from a kitchen fire, and dried meats could double as improvised self-defense tools if necessary. But preserved foods were expensive, and plague made everything even pricier. Wealthier households could stockpile, poorer families scraped by. Spoilage, however, was the real menace. Fresh food spoiled quickly even in the best of times. No refrigeration, no sealed packaging, and a climate that loved to make things rot. During plague times, food turnover slowed dramatically. A marketplace apple didn't need to look good. It just had to still resemble an apple. Bread grew stale within days, often becoming so hard it required softening in broth or ale. If you could afford broth or ale. Otherwise, you simply gnawed and hoped your teeth were having a good day. Meat was the least trustworthy friend in your diet. It spoiled so fast that its shelf life could be measured in hours. Butchers sometimes trimmed off the most questionable parts and sold the rest. Customers pretended not to notice. Denial was a valid culinary strategy. If the meat smelled slightly off, you added more spices. If it smelled completely wrong, you cooked it longer. If it still worried you, you gave it to the dog and observed whether the dog survived until sundown. Grain, the foundation of medieval diets, was both a blessing and a curse. It stored well, but not perfectly. Rats loved grain, loved it with passion, devotion, and zero manners. Grain sacks often hid more than grain, droppings, husks, bugs that had moved in and started families. Medieval cooks sifted, blew, and picked through grain with the determination of someone who had accepted that perfection was impossible. If a few insects made it into the porridge, congratulations, extra protein. Speaking of porridge, it was the dependable workhorse of the medieval table. Wheat, oats, barley, anything that could be boiled until it forgot its original form. Porridge didn't spoil quickly, filled the stomach, and didn't require fancy preparation. It was also bland enough to make you question whether hunger was really that bad. But during plague times, porridge became even more essential because it stretched ingredients. Watered-down meals kept families alive, and taste buds learned to accept defeat. Vegetables appeared when available, which wasn't often. Onions, leeks, turnips, and cabbages were common, but during shortages they could reach scandalous prices. Some vegetables showed up half-wilted or bruised, but as long as they weren't actively walking away, someone would buy them. People didn't eat to enjoy flavours, they ate to continue participating in life. Then there was bread, the backbone of civilization and the cause of many dental tragedies. Fresh bread, soft and fragrant, was rare. Most people ate brown, dense loaves made from coarse grain, often mixed with whatever filler kept costs down. Ground peas, beans, even ground stone dust. Yes, stone dust. The medieval city might not have had good dentistry, but by heaven, it made sure you needed it. During plague times, bakers struggled to get fuel for ovens, grain from mills, and enough healthy workers to sustain production. Bread became smaller, pricier, and sometimes questionably baked. Undercooked bread was a hazard, overcooked bread was a weapon, and properly baked bread was a miracle. Famine pressure made theft more common. Markets hired guards. Households locked pantries. Rats became not just pests but competitors. In some cities, controlling food supplies became a matter of civic survival. Authorities raided hoarders, rationed grain and regulated prices. But regulation meant little when half the officials were sick and the other half were panicking. Street food existed too. Pies, pastries, roasted nuts, and things that claimed to be meat. Meat pies were especially mysterious. Unless you saw the animal alive earlier that morning, you simply didn't ask questions. It's better for everyone that way. And through all of this, food carried a psychological weight. Eating meant you were still alive. Even a hard loaf, a thin stew, or a suspicious bit of fish reminded you that your body was still participating in the struggle. Every bite was a small victory, even if it tasted like a larger defeat. So no, food didn't nourish you. In a plague city, food merely persuaded you to try again tomorrow. If you believed that living in a medieval city meant sharing space with other humans, you're adorably mistaken. Humans were just one category of resident. The true rulers of the urban ecosystem were smaller, furrier, jumpier, and far more enthusiastic about your personal space than you ever were about theirs. The good news, you're not alone. The bad news, you really are. Let's begin with the rats, creatures perfectly designed by nature to thrive in environments built by people with inadequate sanitation, enthusiastic trash piles, and a deep cultural commitment to ignoring structural problems. Medieval rats didn't just survive, they flourished. They scurried under floorboards, nested inside walls, raided grain sacks, memorized household routines, and treated entire neighborhoods like open-concept apartments. The medieval black rat, Rattus rattus, was agile, social, and had no respect for human privacy. They navigated rooftops, beams, rafters, and market stalls with gymnastic precision. They squeezed through cracks the width of your anxieties. They multiplied faster than your ability to trap them, and they were bold, so bold that you might wake to find one staring at you like you were the surprise guest in its room. But the rats were only part of the problem. The real danger came from their tiny sidekicks, fleas, the medieval city's most destructive commuters. Fleas treated rats like mobile apartments, warm, stable, always travelling to exciting new destinations. And when the rat died or got startled or simply felt like sharing, the fleas happily transferred to a new host, you. Here's where things get interesting, and by interesting we mean catastrophic. Fleas didn't bite gently. They bit with commitment. Each bite left behind irritation, infection, or in very unlucky cases, the bacterium responsible for the plague. Fleas were so common that medieval people accepted them as casually as modern people accept mosquitoes. Annoying, unavoidable, and present at the worst possible time. Fleas didn't care about class, wealth, or status. They lived in straw bedding, clothes seams, woven mats, animal fur, your boots, your cloak, and occasionally your dignity. You could shake out your garments each morning and they'd still find a way back to you by lunch. Medieval people even used flea combs, not for grooming, but for negotiating peace terms with their parasites. Houses, especially in crowded cities, were essentially five-star hotels for infestations. Straw mattresses were less beds and more multi-species habitats. Heat from hearth fires created the perfect breeding environment for insects. Roof thatching hosted families of mice. Barns and sheds acted as overflow housing for the world's least hygienic tenants. And because buildings sat so close together, the rats didn't have to choose one home. They chose all of them. As the plague spread, rat populations reacted in ways that affected human survival. When rats became ill and died in large numbers, their fleas needed a new food source. Enter the citizens. Without understanding the microbiology or the connection, townspeople noticed that before outbreaks worsened, rat corpses appeared more frequently. Some city records mention an unusual number of dead animals as a sign of bad air. They weren't wrong about something bad happening, they just misidentified the culprits. The rat-to-human transfer was so invisible and quick. Fleas didn't negotiate, they jumped, they bit, they infected. A single flea could bite dozens of hosts in a short period. And since flea bites were common and expected, no one reacted to the early signs. An itch was an itch. A swelling was a swelling. A fatal illness, unfortunately, was simply a fatal illness. Rodent populations also surged when food supplies fluctuated. Grain stores created buffets for rats. Fish markets attracted scavengers. Refuse pits gave them snacks, nesting materials, and occasionally entertainment. Every part of the city, from the docks to the bakeries, offered prime real estate for infestation. The rats had more reliable access to food than some citizens. Because rats and fleas blended seamlessly into daily life, medieval people rarely considered them threats. They were nuisances, not omens. Children played near them, adults ignored them, cats chased them. But cats could only do so much, especially when they were considered half-wild themselves. Dogs sometimes hunted them, but dogs also occasionally lost these battles, leaving rats free to continue their evening plans. In wealthier homes, revenants waged daily war against rodents, setting traps, blocking holes, sweeping out droppings, and attempting to make the house appear more controlled than it actually was. In poorer homes, people simply learned to coexist. If you lived in a single-room structure with 5 family members, 2 goats, and 3 sacks of grain, a couple of rats barely registered on your mental list of problems. At a certain point, you just sighed and let them attend dinner. The fleas, though, those you felt. You felt them in the middle of the night when they feasted on your ankles. You felt them in the morning when you discovered new bites. You felt them at midday when you tried to ignore the itching during work. Fleas turned every hour into a reminder that no matter how hard you tried to control your surroundings, tiny creatures were controlling you. As the plague tightened its grip, The combined presence of rats and fleas transformed from tolerable annoyance to lethal infrastructure. Every home, every slum shop, every carriage became a tiny relay station in a city-wide network of infection. And no one saw it coming. People blamed miasma, bad luck, moral failing, anything except the real culprits rummaging in their pantries and hopping through their sheets. So yes, you're not alone. You're living with roommates who don't pay rent, don't follow rules, and don't care about your well-being. They were here long before you arrived, and they'll still be here long after you leave, one way or another. If you thought stepping inside a medieval house offered relief from the chaos of the streets, prepare for a fresh wave of disappointment. Medieval homes weren't sanctuaries. They were containment units for heat, smell, noise, family conflict, and occasionally accidental smoke inhalation. Your house kept warmth in and escape out. It wasn't built to protect you. It was built to endure weather, fit in a narrow space, and trap whatever misfortune found its way inside. Let's begin with ventilation, a word medieval builders understood conceptually but rarely applied. Houses had small windows, tiny, narrow, often unglazed openings whose primary job was to let in minimal light and maximum regret. Windows didn't open and close so much as exist. If you wanted fresh air, you might get it by sheer luck, or by smoke drifting out of the roof hole instead of settling in your lungs for the evening. That roof hole, by the way, was the closest thing medieval homes had to a modern exhaust system. Smoke from the hearth was meant to drift upward and out. Instead, it usually lingered, meandered, reconsidered its life choices, and then filled the rafters like a permanent resident. Medieval homes had a smell: wood smoke, old rushes, cooking fat, bodies, animals, and that undefinable scent of a lot is happening in here, and none of it is good. Over time, the walls absorbed these smells so thoroughly that they became part of the architecture. Historians can describe medieval homes. Archaeologists can still smell them. Inside houses were small, shockingly small. Your entire living space might be a single room that performed every role: bedroom, kitchen, dining area, storage closet, and therapeutic screaming chamber. Larger homes existed, of course, but even large in medieval terms meant something like 2 or 3 rooms stacked vertically in a precarious arrangement that defies modern building codes. And stairs? Stairs were steep, dark, narrow, and ready at any moment to betray you. Climbing them required balance, faith, and a willingness to accept future leg injuries. Shared walls created another dimension of medieval living: community through acoustic suffering. Houses were built so close together that your neighbours' arguments, lullabies, domestic mishaps, and suspicious thuds were as much a part of your soundscape as your own. Privacy didn't exist. Eavesdropping didn't exist either, because why eavesdrop on something you're already hearing at full volume through timber planks thinner than your resolve? Some cities built houses so tightly packed that entire streets became enclosed tunnels of leaning buildings. Over time, upper floors overhung the road so dramatically that neighbours across the street could pass items from window to window without needing to lean out. This was ideal if you wanted to borrow a cup of flour, and potentially disastrous if someone had an argument while gesturing too enthusiastically. Crowding was constant. Families were large and houses were small. Children, grandparents, animals, possessions, tools, everything and everyone lived together in an arrangement best described as, "We'll make it work somehow." There was no such thing as personal space. You slept beside siblings, cousins, or whoever else lived in your home, all packed so tightly that getting up at night required choreographed movements. And yes, animals lived inside too, because leaving them outdoors was a great way to make them somebody else's animals by morning. Chickens clucked at your feet, goats bleated from the corner, cats prowled along beams, and dogs claimed floor space long before you did. Cows sometimes lived indoors in winter. Your home was less a private residence and more a cross-species sleepover. Heating was simple but atmospheric. The hearth was the heart of the home, warm, glowing, and responsible for approximately 30% of indoor smoke trauma. It cooked your meals, warmed your bones, dried your clothes, and occasionally set something on fire. If the room was too hot, you couldn't fix it. If the room was too cold, you couldn't fix that either. Comfort was a luxury nobody had had time to invent yet. The building materials themselves added character. Wattle and daub walls, a mixture of mud, straw and sticks, cracked easily, absorbed moisture, and hosted entire ecosystems of insects. Timber frames creaked at night, making every house sound faintly haunted, even when the ghosts had the night off. Floors were covered in rushes, layers of reeds spread across the ground and replaced infrequently enough that older layers decomposed into a fragrant mulch underfoot. When fresh rushes were added, they were simply placed on top of the old ones, like medieval carpeting meets compost. During a plague, these houses became traps. Poor ventilation meant the air was stagnant. Close quarters meant sick family members breathed directly into your future. Shared walls meant you could hear your neighbour coughing long before they realised they should be worried. And cramped stairways ensured that when panic eventually set in, evacuating quickly was the architectural equivalent of a bad joke. But despite the discomfort, the noise, the smells, and the architectural self-esteem issues, medieval people saw their homes as places of identity and pride. A house was not merely a building, it was stability, however smoky, crowded, and structurally questionable that stability might be. And so you lived in it, embraced it, tolerated it, and prayed the walls didn't lean any further this year. Your house kept warmth in and escape out. And in a plague city, both of those facts mattered more than you wanted to admit. Sleep, in a medieval plague city, was less a biological necessity and more a daring experiment. You didn't rest, you waited horizontally, hoping the world outside and inside your own home didn't collapse before morning. Night wasn't peaceful, night was a second shift of anxiety, and everyone participated whether they wanted to or not. The first challenge was noise, because medieval cities did not believe in silence. Even after the sun set, after the markets closed, the smiths cooled their forges, and the streets finally emptied, sound clung to the air. Roof beams creaked as temperatures shifted. Dogs barked at shadows that weren't quite shadows. Stray cats conducted musical duels under windows. Wind threaded through crooked alleys, howling as if auditioning for the role of omen. And then there was the coughing. During a plague, coughing was the soundtrack of nighttime life. It wasn't a gentle, polite cough. It was a harsh, chest-deep hacking sound that carried through thin walls, up rafters, down stairwells, and into the ears of anyone who had dared to consider sleep. You didn't need to see your sick neighbour to know how the night was going for them. Their lungs narrated the entire experience. Inside your home, it wasn't much better. Medieval families slept together in shared spaces, sometimes all in one bed, often on straw pallets packed closely to preserve warmth. Normally this closeness was a comfort. During plague, it was a constant reminder that proximity was not your friend. If one person in the household coughed even once, everyone else froze. Was it smoke irritation? Dust? A harmless tickle? Or the first whisper of doom? You lay awake, listening, waiting for a second cough, because in plague times the second cough told the truth. The darkness didn't help. Medieval nights were truly dark, no electric lamps, no glowing screens, not even consistent candlelight. A single candle could cost more than a day's wages, so you didn't burn it lightly unless you wanted to stare directly into poverty. Most households used the fire's dying embers as their only illumination. Shadows grew and shifted around you. Anything could be lurking in the dark, a rat investigating your shoe, a flea making dinner plans, or your imagination staging a full theatrical production. Sleep wasn't a release, it was a negotiation. And then there was the fear, a constant presence that sat on the edge of every straw mattress. Daytime made it possible to pretend. You had work to do, errands to run, food to find, people to talk to. Daylight offered distraction. Night took all of that away, stripped the world down to you, the ceiling beams, the breathing of the people around you, and questions you weren't prepared to answer. What if you woke up sick? What if someone next to you didn't wake up at all? What if the plague reached your street tonight? Medieval people believed nighttime carried spiritual danger as well. With darkness came demons, evil air, wandering spirits, and unseen forces waiting to slip into vulnerable bodies. If you felt a sudden chill, you didn't blame the poorly sealed walls, you blamed something supernatural taking interest. This added a whole new layer to insomnia. Not only were you afraid of disease, but also of whatever else your culture insisted was lurking behind the veil. The overcrowding didn't help. In many homes, space was so limited that bodies lay shoulder to shoulder on platforms, benches, or directly on the floor. Children sprawled on parents. Siblings slept in tangled piles. Animals dozed in corners. Every shift, every sigh, every twitch became a chain reaction of movement. If one person pulled a blanket, someone else lost a blanket. If someone turned over, a knee or elbow relocated itself into your ribs. If a baby cried, nobody slept. Even when the room quieted, the air itself was heavy. Fires burned low, consuming oxygen and releasing smoke. Straw bedding released dust every time someone moved. The scent of sweat, fear, cooked food, and the day's labour lingered in the air, thick and warm. Breathing felt like participating in a communal soup. Some families tried to improve their odds by sleeping in shifts, half awake, half resting. Others prayed before bed, hoping divine mercy extended to insomnia. Some clutched charms meant to ward off evil. A few placed herbs near the bed for protection, despite the fact that herbs were famously incompetent against airborne bacteria. But fear makes even the least effective plan feel comforting. There were also nights when death visited. Not metaphorically, someone in the household would pass unexpectedly. Medieval cities had no emergency services, no systems to handle the situation. Families faced it alone, in silence, waiting for dawn to announce what had already happened. And the rest of the house, eyes open, breaths shallow, waited too. Sleep became a scarce resource. People drifted in and out of shallow dozes, never fully surrendering consciousness. Dreams, when they came, were often brief, confused, or unpleasant. You didn't fall asleep, you were ambushed by it. And you didn't wake rested. You woke because something, noise, fear, coughing, or instinct, dragged you back to awareness. Yet every morning you rose anyway, half-rested, half-functioning, wholly aware that night would come again, and with it, the same horizontal waiting. In a plague city, sleep wasn't rest. It was survival theatre. When the plague tightened its grip on a medieval city, people naturally turned to the figures who were supposed to safeguard human life, the doctors. Unfortunately, medieval medicine had one defining characteristic: absolute confidence balanced delicately on top of absolutely nothing. The doctor was certain. Reality was not. And between those two forces, Mahor. You lay on a wooden table trying very hard not to panic. Let's begin with the training of medieval doctors. Medical education was less scientific discipline and more philosophical reading marathon. Universities taught medicine, yes, but the curriculum consisted mostly of memorizing Greek and Roman authors, especially Hippocrates and Galen. These men had been dead for over 1,000 years, but medieval doctors quoted them with a level of devotion modern people reserve for tax instructions or celebrity gossip. Experience mattered far less than your ability to recite passages that sounded intelligent. You might imagine a doctor learning by treating patients, observing symptoms, and developing insight. Instead, they learned by debating bodily fluids in lecture halls. If you wanted to impress your peers, you didn't cure anything, you explained things in Latin. This brings us to their central belief system, humorism. According to medieval medical doctrine, human health depended on the perfect balance of 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, one of these was misbehaving. If you were dying, several were apparently throwing a party. The solution: remove or rebalance these fluids using an impressive array of tools that ranged from unpleasant to you, are you sure this is legal? And because diagnosis relied on humours, doctors approached plague patients with thrilling overconfidence. They couldn't identify bacteria, fleas, or transmission patterns, but they could assure you your black bile was staging a rebellion. Let's talk authority, because being a medieval doctor was as much a performance as a profession. Doctors wore impressive robes, carried ornate staffs, and positioned themselves as educated elite. They projected calm mastery and a level of self-assurance wildly disproportionate to the success rate of their treatments. When they spoke, people listened, not because the advice made sense, but because doctors charged more money than everyone else, and surely a high fee implied competence. Some doctors even travelled with apprentices whose job was essentially to nod supportively, carry tools, and hand over money pouches with convincing gravitas. Medicine had flair, even if it didn't have results. During plague times, the most iconic medical figure was the plague doctor, famous for wearing a long dark robe, gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and, most importantly, a beaked mask filled with herbs. Today the mask looks theatrical or terrifying. In the medieval mind it was protective. The herbs were meant to purify the air. The beak was meant to keep bad air from reaching the lungs. Sadly, bacteria did not share this belief system. Still, the plague doctor's appearance inspired confidence. After all, nothing says I know what I'm doing like dressing as a bird and striding into crisis with a stick to poke the sick from a safe distance. Now, let's discuss treatments, which hovered somewhere between medieval science fiction and medieval torture. Many doctors believed disease should be removed from the body physically. This led to procedures like bloodletting, which involved slicing open veins to drain excess blood. If you survived the procedure, the doctor considered it a success. If you didn't, well, you clearly had far too much humour imbalance to begin with. Cupping, where heated cups were placed on your skin to draw out bad vapours, leaving behind impressive circular bruises that signified absolutely nothing biologically useful. Lancing buboes, which doctors performed with alarming enthusiasm. This involved cutting open swollen lymph nodes to release corruption. The results were wet and not beneficial. Herbal concoctions that included ingredients such as mint, rose petals, vinegar, ground pearls, and occasionally substances one should never ingest on purpose. Doctors loved prescribing mixtures because it made them sound sophisticated. Purgatives, which aimed to cleanse the body by making you regret every decision that led to this moment. Doctors didn't lack effort, they simply lacked tools that worked. One of the most dangerous aspects of medieval medical care was certainty. A doctor could enter your home, diagnose you with poetic flourish, prescribe a treatment with academic confidence, and leave with the serene belief that he had improved your situation. Meanwhile, your situation had either stayed the same, worsened, or rapidly become fatal. And yet medieval people trusted their doctors because the alternative was having no explanation at all. Medical authority offered structure, meaning, and the comforting illusion that someone understood the chaos around them, even if that understanding was built entirely on outdated theories and wishful thinking. It's important to note that not all medical practitioners were university trained. Many were barber surgeons, individuals who cut hair, performed minor surgery, extracted teeth, stitched wounds, and occasionally conducted bloodletting with the same tools used for shaving. If you ever wondered why the barber pole is striped red and white, the red represents blood. A charming reminder that haircuts and medical procedures once came from the same man holding the same sharp object. There were also wise women, herbalists and midwives, figures often dismissed by male physicians despite having far more practical experience. These individuals understood local plants, poultices, and remedies that actually relieved symptoms. But social hierarchy being what it was, their knowledge was considered folk wisdom, while a doctor's Latin commentary on humours, completely disconnected from human anatomy, was considered superior. In the end, medieval medical care was a paradox. Doctors were respected but ineffective. Treatments were elaborate but harmful. Knowledge was valued but wildly inaccurate. When a doctor walked into your home, you felt both hope and dread. Hope that someone might help you. Dread that their help might include knives. The doctor was certain. Reality was not. And in a city ravaged by plague, certainty was often the most dangerous ingredient of all. If you fell ill in a medieval plague city, you might imagine that treatment, however primitive, offered some hope. This is adorable. Medieval cures didn't just fail, they failed loudly, painfully, and with enough enthusiasm to make you wonder whether the disease or the doctor was the real threat. There was no anesthesia, unless you count passing out, which many patients did, sometimes voluntarily. Let's begin with the reigning monarch of medieval medical logic, bloodletting. If doctors were priests of the humoral universe, bloodletting was their holy ritual. The idea was simple. Too much blood made you sick. The solution was simpler. Remove it. They cut veins with cheerful confidence, allowing your life essence to exit your body in the hope that disease would leave with it. Spoiler, it did not. But dizziness did. And fainting. And sometimes your will to continue. Bloodletting could be done with a lancet, a sharp tool that looked like it had been forged by someone who disliked wrists. Or, for variety, doctors used leeches, nature's little interns. They latched on, sucked until full, then detached and waddled away like tiny water balloons of disappointment. Patients usually endured several rounds, because if losing a moderate amount of blood didn't help, clearly losing more would. Then there were poultices, mixtures of herbs, spices, flowers, animal fats, and hope. These were slapped onto buboes, rashes, or anything else that resembled a symptom. Some poultices contained onion or garlic, others relied on butter or breadcrumbs. A few involved pigeon parts because someone somewhere decided that birds were medicinally absorbent. The logic, if you press something smelly onto something deadly, perhaps the plague will surrender out of confusion. One legendary poultice used crushed emeralds. Yes, emeralds. Because nothing says I understand disease like grinding up jewellery and rubbing it on swollen lymph nodes. Only the very wealthy could afford such pharmaceutical luxuries, and these wealthy patients usually died anyway, just expensively. Boiling remedies were another crowd favourite. A doctor might recommend boiling herbs in vinegar or wine, then applying the hot mixture directly to the skin. This worked beautifully if your goal was to add burns to your list of problems. Patients howled, poultices sizzled, and doctors nodded approvingly, confident that anything this painful simply had to be working. For internal illnesses, doctors prescribed drinks and tonics with ingredients that would make a modern pharmacist faint. Popular choices included vinegar thickened with ashes, syrups made from rose petals and ground bone potions containing mercury. Yes, mercury. Draughts of wine infused with lead-based powders, and everyone's favourite, theriac, an expensive cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, including honey, cinnamon, and sometimes literal poisonous snakes. If you survived these concoctions, the disease barely got credit. There was also the category of treatments I like to call "Did anyone ask if this was a good idea?" For instance, fumigation. Doctors burned herbs, resins, pepper, and occasionally old shoes to purify the air. Patients inhaled smoke so thick it blurred reality. The plague didn't retreat, but you might momentarily forget why you were suffering. Hot irons. Some practitioners believed applying a heated metal rod to swollen buboes would draw out toxins. This was excruciating. Patients screamed, families cried, doctors congratulated themselves, and the plague continued, politely ignoring the entire scene. Animal-based remedies. This magical category included rubbing a live chicken on a bubo. Not a feather, not a wing, a whole chicken. The belief was that the chicken would draw the illness into itself. Imagine being gravely ill and having someone press a confused hen against your armpit while insisting it's for your own good. If the chicken died, they considered the treatment successful. If you died, they said the treatment came too late. Mystical cures also circulated, especially when medical knowledge hit its limits, which was often. These included wearing amulets filled with herbs, dried flowers, or Latin inscriptions, placing special stones over painful areas, and sleeping with talismans that promised divine protection. These didn't work biologically, but at least they didn't make the situation worse. an achievement few medieval treatments could claim. Unfortunately, plague sufferers often endured multiple cures simultaneously, which meant bloodletting, plus poultices, plus tonics, plus fumigation, plus prayer. This was less a treatment plan and more a medical buffet, and hovering over all of this was the medieval belief that pain meant progress. If a cure hurt, burned, stung, or made you vomit, practitioners reassured you that the illness was being forced out. In reality, your body was simply filing complaints against everyone involved. Yet medieval people continued trusting these treatments because the alternative, doing nothing, felt unbearable. Cures created structure, meaning, and a sense of agency in a world where disease hid in every corner. Suffering wasn't just medical, it was psychological. People needed to believe that something, anything, could help. But plague was relentless. It didn't care about poultices or jewel dust or chickens. It moved quickly, killed efficiently, and ignored the best efforts of doctors who'd been trained in manuscripts instead of reality. So if you found yourself sick in a medieval plague city, your options were limited. You could visit a doctor confident in the wrong theories. You could submit to a series of cures that hurt before they failed. Or you could brace yourself and hope your immune system had hidden talents. There was no anesthesia, unless you count passing out, and many did. When the plague swept through a medieval city, people turned instinctively toward the most powerful institution they knew, the church. Medicine might have been confused, ineffective, or just accidentally violent, but religion had clarity, structure, and answers, even if those answers tended to be variations of try harder. Faith was strong, germ theory was shy. And so spiritual treatment became the first, last, and often only line of defense. To a medieval mind, illness wasn't merely physical, it was cosmic. The plague wasn't caused by invisible organisms, it was sent. Maybe as punishment, maybe as a test, maybe as a divine reminder that humanity should behave better. Whatever the reason, the reasoning was clear. If sickness came from God, then cure must follow the same route. This led to the most widespread treatment of all, prayer. People prayed in homes, in churches, in fields, in groups, alone, loudly, softly, desperately. They prayed for protection, forgiveness, healing, and occasionally for better neighbours. Families knelt together each night, whispering petitions into the air, hoping heaven was accepting urgent requests. Children recited memorised lines, not always understanding them, but understanding the trembling in their parents' voices. Elders clutched rosaries until their knuckles whitened. Prayer didn't cure plague, of course, but it offered something equally necessary, a sense of participation. You couldn't fight the disease, but you could fight despair. Churches became the emotional hub of the crisis. Bells tolled constantly. Funerals, masses, vigils, warnings. People gathered in great halls heavy with incense, which priests swung through the air not only for ritual, but because they believed sacred smoke could neutralize deadly miasmas. If the air was dangerous, fill it with holiness. Simple logic. Unsuccessful, but simple. Public processions became another spiritual remedy. Citizens walked through the streets together, chanting prayers, carrying candles, lifting statues of saints believed to offer protection. These processions were powerful, moving, and in hindsight, exceptionally good at helping disease spread. Large crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, wiping tears with shared cloths, touching the same sacred objects. If the plague hadn't reached you yet, a procession did the plague a favour by bringing you to it. And then there were the relics, objects associated with saints, biblical figures, holy events. Medieval Europe practically sparkled with relics. Bone fragments, scraps of fabric, vials of holy dust, bits of wood from the true cross, teeth from saints who somehow had several dozen each. Whether authentic or suspiciously well stocked, relics were treasured. People touched them, kissed them, prayed beside them. In times of plague, cities borrowed relics from one another, though a city never really loaned its best relics. It allowed supervised visitation. Families lined up for hours to receive blessings from relics. Priests held them over the sick. Processions carried them through the streets like glowing talismans of survival. Relics didn't cure disease, but they cured hopelessness, at least temporarily. Alongside formal religious practice existed a vibrant layer of superstition, customs that weren't officially endorsed but circulated widely anyway. People wore amulets filled with herbs, believing certain plants repelled evil. They hung charms over doorways, buried items in thresholds, or tied protective knots in clothing. Some painted crosses on their homes, others smeared symbolic markings on windowsills to ward off plague-bearing spirits. The line between medicine and superstition blurred regularly. For example, many people believed that certain saints specialized in certain ailments. St. Roche protected against plague. St. Sebastian guarded against sudden death. If your symptoms were unclear, you prayed to both. Medieval multitasking. Then there were rituals that combined spiritual logic with creative personal interpretation. Some families kept candles burning at all hours because light discouraged evil. Others refused to extinguish the hearth fire, believing a living flame guarded the home. A few households banned certain colours of clothing, claiming the plague was attracted to specific shades, proof that, even in crisis, humans will blame anything except their own sanitation system. The clergy themselves played a complex role. Priests gave last rites to the dying, risking infection daily. Many perished, making them some of the highest mortality groups during the plague. Monks tended the sick in monasteries, offering food, comfort, and prayer. Nuns provided hospice care, sometimes more effectively than doctors. Their work was not always medically helpful, but it was socially indispensable. Yet not all religious responses were comforting. Some preached that plague was divine punishment for sin. This sparked acts of penance, some private, some public, some extreme. People fasted, wept openly, confessed sins loudly, or gave away possessions to cleanse their souls. It wasn't uncommon to hear wails echoing through the streets at night, repentance blending with fear. And then came the flagellants, groups of wandering penitents who performed dramatic rituals. They marched from town to town, whipping their own backs until blood flowed, believing that suffering purified humanity and would persuade God to lift the plague. Crowds gathered to watch, sometimes half horrified, half inspired. Though religious authorities disapproved of the practice, flagellants multiplied quickly. An ironic response, considering the plague encouraged everyone else to avoid large gatherings. Despite everything, religion offered something no medical remedy could: a narrative. The plague wasn't random chaos. It had purpose, meaning, explanation. Maybe inaccurate explanation, but explanation nonetheless. In a world where the cause of disease was invisible, spiritual frameworks filled the void. Medieval people didn't rely on religion because they were ignorant. They relied on it because it was the only system that made emotional sense. When the world became incomprehensible, faith translated terror into story. Faith was strong, germ theory was shy, and in the darkness of a plague-stricken city, story was sometimes the only thing that helped you endure. When plague tightened its grip on a medieval city, authorities did what authorities always do in a crisis: panic creatively. With no understanding of bacteria, no concept of fleas as vectors, and no medical treatment that didn't also double as a war crime, city leaders relied on the one tool they did understand: quarantine. And medieval quarantine was not gentle. It was social distancing enforced with nails. The idea behind quarantine wasn't entirely wrong. If someone was sick, keep them away from the healthy. Simple, effective in theory, slightly less charming in execution. Let's begin with the most infamous tactic: locking houses from the outside. Whenever a household showed symptoms, anything from fever to unexplained swelling to one bad cough at the wrong time, the city's appointed officers, often called searchers or wardens, would arrive at the door. Their job was to protect the public, which mostly meant ensuring nobody from the sick household escaped to continue breathing in public spaces. Once the order was given, carpenters hammered boards across the doors and windows. Curtains fell, nails thudded. The house became a sealed container of fear. Families inside were forced to remain home for weeks, sometimes longer, regardless of how many people were sick or how many were still healthy. In some cities, guards were stationed outside with long poles, not swords, to keep the inhabitants from slipping out. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was consistent. For households judged especially dangerous, authorities placed marks on the door, symbols warning others to stay away. Crosses, circles, painted signs, or even parchment notices hung by string. These marks transformed your home from a place of comfort into a public billboard of suffering. Neighbours avoided passing too close. Children whispered about the mark. Strangers muttered prayers as they walked by. In a way, the mark quarantined your reputation as much as your body. Inside the sealed house, life became strange and claustrophobic. The sick groaned in corners. The healthy paced restlessly. Supplies dwindled as days passed. Some cities attempted to provide food or water to quarantined families, but deliveries were inconsistent and workers were terrified of getting too close. Offerings were left on doorsteps, sometimes smashed or contaminated by animals before anyone could retrieve them. Quarantine could feel like slow-motion abandonment. To enforce containment, cities hired watchmen, a position that attracted a mixture of civic-minded citizens, desperate labourers, and individuals whose personalities suggested they enjoyed authority a little too much. Their job was to monitor quarantined houses, shout warnings at passers-by, and ensure nobody tried to slip out under cover of darkness. Picture a guard whose entire job is to yell, "No, go back inside," at people who have had enough of their living room. Watchmen received modest pay, occasional hostility, and absolutely no training. They also occasionally deserted their posts, which meant sometimes the only thing truly enforcing quarantine was the wooden boards, and whatever moral fortitude the family inside could muster. Outside the quarantine zone, the city issued isolation laws. Some were sensible. Marketplaces restricted stall spacing, funeral gatherings were reduced, and travel between neighbourhoods was discouraged. Others were medieval. For example, banning certain trades from operating, especially those involving door-to-door contact, blocking entire streets if one household fell ill, requiring anyone suspected of contact with the sick to remain indoors for a set number of days, regardless of their symptoms or lack thereof, ordering that goods from infected areas be burned, buried, or soaked in vinegar, so aggressively that the goods no longer resembled goods. Every city interpreted quarantine differently. In some places, quarantine lasted 20 days. In others, 30. In a few, it stretched to 40 days, giving rise to the Italian word quarantina, the ancestor of our modern term. The logic? 40 was a biblically impressive number. If it worked for Noah's rainstorm, surely it could work for disease. But quarantine didn't just restrict the sick. It restricted movement, commerce, and hope. Ships arriving in port were forced to anchor offshore for weeks. Crews pacing restlessly on a deck, watching city lights they weren't allowed to approach. Caravans outside city walls waited in lonely encampments, hoping authorities would relent. Messengers were turned away, letters fumigated with herbs, fabrics aired out for weeks before sale. Meanwhile, wealthier citizens often exercised the most powerful quarantine strategy of all, leaving early. When plague whispers started circulating, nobles retreated to country estates, creating private quarantines with more land, more food, and significantly fewer shouting watchmen. Their escape wasn't exactly subtle. When half the upper class is seen riding out the gates in a hurry, it doesn't take a genius to interpret the signs. The poor, however, were trapped by geography, finances, and the unmistakable sound of hammering boards. This created a strange pattern in the city. Some neighbourhoods grew eerily quiet as entire households vanished behind nailed doors, while others bustled with the business of survival, pretending normalcy because normalcy felt safer than acknowledging what was happening. Even when quarantines failed, and fail they often did, cities continued using them because they offered something rare during plague: control. Illness moved invisibly. Containment, however flawed, was visible. Boards on doors said, "We're doing something." Watchmen pacing streets said, "We're trying." Marks on homes said, "Danger lives here." adjust your path accordingly, and sometimes quarantine truly did slow the spread. Not enough to prevent catastrophe, but enough to buy days. Days that mattered for those who needed time to flee, pray, gather supplies, or simply brace themselves emotionally. Quarantine was harsh, frightening, and often unjust, but it was also one of the first attempts in human history at organised public health. Social distancing enforced with nails, primitive, brutal, and for many the only hope they had. There comes a moment in every plague-stricken city when people stop saying, "This will pass soon," and start asking, "Is this forever?" In the early days, denial worked beautifully. Authorities promised control, priests promised protection, doctors promised theories, and neighbours promised that surely things would improve. But promises have a short shelf life during a plague. Eventually the city felt the shift, the unmistakable turning point when everyone realised this wasn't going away. Hope didn't vanish, it quietly packed its bags. The shift usually began with the numbers. Medieval cities didn't keep modern statistics, but people didn't need charts to understand what was happening. They counted the funerals, they counted the empty market stalls, they counted which neighbours' windows went dark and stayed that way. By the time every street had at least one shuttered house marked for sickness, denial evaporated. Even the soundscape changed. At first, the city's bells rang occasionally, a sombre reminder. Then they tolled multiple times a day. Then they tolled so often that time itself seemed measured by death. Bells overlapped, bells merged, bells lost their meaning. After a while, families stopped asking who was it, because the answer was always someone. As the crisis deepened, panic bloomed, not in sudden bursts, but in creeping waves. People who once walked confidently now hurried, eyes lowered, as if trying to avoid making eye contact with fate. Market vendors still opened their stalls, but they did it with trembling hands, constantly glancing around for signs of trouble. Buyers approached food as if approaching a dangerous animal, slowly or hesitantly, with second thoughts attached to every coin. Social order frayed, not shattered, not broken, frayed, like an old rope slowly unravelling. Markets shortened their hours, workers failed to appear, apprentices disappeared to tend to dying parents, even beggars, normally the most persistent figures in a city, thinned out. Those who remained asked for alms, not with outstretched hands, but with haunted eyes. Fear changed the way people moved. Streets once bustling with shouts and laughter grew tense. Strangers kept distanced, friends hesitated to embrace. Some people wrapped scarves around their faces, not because they understood airborne disease, but because fear makes people invent rituals. Others walked with sprigs of herbs pressed under their noses, muttering prayers as they passed infected homes. Children sensed everything. They played more quietly, they watched adults for cues, they whispered questions no one wanted to answer. Even their games changed, from tag to hiding, from pretending to be knights to pretending to escape danger. When children stopped laughing, the city understood things were dire. As the death toll rose, despair seeped into daily life. It settled into homes, markets, churches and workshops. It dulled ambition. It slowed conversation. It hollowed out the energy of survival. Tradespeople worked only when necessary, then returned home quickly. Employers stopped enforcing rules. Apprenticeships paused because there was no guarantee the master would survive long enough to teach anything. Processions ceased, not by order, but because no one had the strength to organise them. Even gossip died down. Eventually, no Rumia could compete with the reality in front of everyone. Nighttime grew worse. It was no longer just fear that kept people awake. It was grief. Quiet weeping drifted through walls. Some families stayed awake on purpose, unwilling to face the silence. Others slept restlessly, waking often to check on loved ones, to listen for coughing, to ensure no one had slipped away unnoticed. Despair also brought out the extremes in human nature. Some people became fiercely protective, barred doors, strict routines, obsessive cleaning. Others became reckless, gathering in taverns, insisting life must go on even if going on was clearly a terrible idea. And a few, stripped down to raw survival, did whatever they needed to do, steal food, abandon responsibilities, flee without warning. The city's leadership struggled too. Officials issued orders, then reversed them. They proposed solutions, then contradicted them. They tried to calm the public, then panicked privately. Meetings stretched for hours, voices rose, tempers flared. And still, the plague advanced with quiet efficiency. Leadership wasn't useless. It was simply outmatched. For many, the turning point came when the helpers disappeared. Doctors fell ill. Priests succumbed. Gravediggers died in their own trenches. When the people responsible for comforting the city fled or collapsed, the emotional fabric of society gave way. If the strong couldn't survive, what chance did the ordinary have? As despair deepened, some people turned inward, retreating into their homes both physically and mentally. They lit fewer candles, they spoke less. They sat by windows, watching empty streets, feeling time stretch into something unfamiliar. Survival became less about living and more about waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for relief, waiting for death, waiting for the plague to decide. But amidst this darkness, small sparks of resilience flickered. Neighbours left bread quietly on doorsteps. Children gathered flowers for the ill. Families sang hymns at dusk. These gestures didn't fight the disease, but they fought despair. They reminded the city that while the plague was relentless, human kindness was stubborn. Still, everyone knew the truth. This wasn't passing. It wasn't fading. It wasn't temporary. The plague had moved in, and hope, sensing it was out of its depth, quietly packed its bags. When the plague swept through the city, it did something no ruler, no law, and no invading army had ever managed. It rewrote the job market overnight. Occupations that once guaranteed steady income suddenly guaranteed something else entirely: rapid proximity to death. Employment was steady. Survival was not. Some people lost work because customers vanished. Others lost work because markets closed. Workshops emptied, or their employers died before payday. But a select group, an unfortunate, necessary, and involuntarily courageous group, found themselves in constant demand. Their jobs didn't stop for the plague. Their jobs existed because of the plague. Let's begin with the most overworked, underappreciated, and shortest-lived professionals of the crisis: gravediggers. Gravediggers were suddenly the busiest people in the entire city. In normal years, their work was steady and sombre. In plague years, it was relentless, back-breaking, and nearly impossible to keep up with. Bodies arrived faster than graves could be dug. The earth refused to cooperate. Dry in some seasons, muddy in others, always difficult when you most needed it not to be. Tools broke, muscles failed, hands blistered, and every day the gravediggers stepped closer to the very danger they buried. Their work was physically exhausting, but the psychological toll was worse. They saw death in quantities no human mind is built to absorb. They carried bodies of strangers, neighbours, friends. They worked at dawn and worked at dusk, sometimes worked by torchlight when daylight wasn't enough. They wore no protection, just their clothes, their determination, and occasionally a cloth tied around their face for courage more than actual filtration. And the risk, immense. Handling infected bodies meant touching clothes, linen, skin, and fluids crawling with bacteria. If any profession symbolized necessary but doomed, it was this one. Entire teams of gravediggers collapsed mid-task, replaced by new recruits equally unprepared for what awaited them. Mass graves became common not because of neglect, but because the living could not keep pace with the dead. Next on the disaster roster were nurses and caregivers, a category that included anyone brave or desperate, enough to tend to the sick. Some were paid attendants, some were family members, some were volunteers, some were simply people unable to refuse when neighbours begged for help. Regardless of title, they faced the same hazard: constant exposure. They brought water, changed bedding, wiped sweat, cleaned wounds, fed broth to trembling lips, and held hands through feverish nights. They listened to delirious rambling. They watched helplessly as symptoms intensified. They absorbed grief after grief until numbness settled in like a second skin. There were no gloves, no disinfectants, no masks, just instinct, compassion, and hope. The closer they leaned over their patients, the more danger they inhaled. Many nurses died early in the outbreak, which made recruitment challenging. Eventually, city leaders resorted to coercion, offering wages so high they bordered on bribery. Of course, wages mean little when you're too dead to spend them. Then there were priests, the spiritual frontline workers of the plague. If gravediggers handled the bodies and nurses handled the suffering, priests handled the souls. Their presence was essential. They offered last rites, comforted families, prayed beside the dying, and conducted burials. Even people who had avoided church for years called for a priest when their time approached. Priests went from home to home, crossing paths with infection constantly. They knelt beside beds where fever burnt through blankets. They leaned close to hear confessions whispered through fading breath. They stood over open graves, preached over coughing mourners, and performed rituals with hands that shook from exhaustion. And the plague treated them no differently than anyone else. Clergy died in enormous numbers. Entire parishes were left without leadership. Monasteries that once held dozens of monks found themselves operating with a fraction of their members. Priests were often some of the earliest to fall because they were the first called to every deathbed. In many cities, messengers and couriers also faced mortal risk. Their jobs required crossing through infected neighbourhoods, carrying letters between quarantined districts, and sometimes transporting goods when others refused. They stepped across doorways marked with warning signs, navigated alleys that smelled of sickness, and delivered messages no one wanted to write. Some carried lists of the dead, some carried pleas for help, some carried nothing but news, the kind that made faces pale. Other high-risk professions emerged unintentionally. Searchers, individuals appointed to identify plague cases, entered infected homes to confirm illness. Their job was to look at buboes, examine fevers, question households, and then report cases to authorities. They performed crucial work. They also rarely survived long. Many searchers were older women, the poor, the widowed, the desperate, people the city exploited because others refused the role. Meanwhile, watchmen overseeing quarantined homes faced a different danger: proximity. They paced outside infected buildings, interacting with families through windows or doors, taking deliveries from citizens who had been exposed, and occasionally helping carry bodies. A single cough could be the end of them. But the most tragic victims of occupational hazard were family caregivers, people who never saw themselves as professionals but became them overnight. They tended to their sick out of love, obligation, or sheer survival instinct. They didn't choose their role. It chose them. Parents nursed children, children nursed parents, spouses nursed spouses. And because plague was merciless, one caregiver's devotion often became their undoing. What made these jobs so dangerous wasn't just exposure, it was frequency. Every day brought a new patient, a new task, a new risk. There was no break, no isolation period, no safe zone. Work itself became a daily gamble. Employment was steady. Survival was not. And the medieval city watched helplessly as its bravest workers, its diggers, tenders, healers, confessors, protectors, shouldered the weight of tragedy until they could bear it no longer. If sight showed you that a medieval city was dying, smell was the sense that confirmed it. Long before you reached a street, a doorway, or a crowded lane, the air delivered the news directly to your face. In a plague city, your nose learned things it could never forget, things it never asked to learn, things it wished it could unlearn, and things it quietly resented you for exposing it to. The scent of decay was the city's dominant perfume. It lingered in alleys, drifted through markets, and clung to clothing like invisible dust. In normal times, medieval cities already didn't smell great. Between animal waste, human waste, cooking fumes, and the general aroma of life lived without plumbing, The senses took daily punishment. But plague added an entirely new layer: the smell of bodies. As death numbers rose, burial could not keep up. Corpses remained in homes for days, sometimes longer, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to move them. When bodies left houses, they were often carried through streets on stretchers, carts, or simply by men gripping blankets. Hours in the sun deepened the odour to something unmistakable. Entire districts began to smell of mortality, a scent so strong it carved itself into memory. But the smell wasn't uniform. It shifted depending on the stage of decay, the weather, and the number of bodies waiting for burial. Warm days thickened the air. Damp mornings spread the scent of rot like fog. Even the breeze betrayed people, carrying faint whispers of death from one neighbourhood to another. Residents didn't ask, "Is someone dead nearby?" They asked, "How close?" To counter these unbearable smells, citizens turned to smoke, the medieval all-purpose deodorizer. People burned anything that produced a strong odour: wood, herbs, spices, resin, even old shoes if nothing else was available. Fires smouldered in hearths, braziers, courtyards, and along streets. Thick smoke curled through windows and doorways, slip-slipping into every crevice. The goal wasn't to remove the bad smells, it was to outcompete them. Rosemary, sage, juniper, and lavender were favourites, but city dwellers burned so much of these that supplies dwindled quickly. Vendors charged outrageous prices for bundles of herbs because everyone believed strongly scented smoke cleansed the air and warded off illness. Houses filled with fragrant clouds that clung to hair, clothes, and absolutely everything else. You didn't walk through the city, you waded through smells. Priests added another layer with incense, which drifted constantly from churches. During plague outbreaks, churches burned more incense than ever, filling sacred spaces with sharp, holy fragrance meant to purify the air and comfort the soul. The result was a mixture of sandalwood, frankincense, myrrh, and human anxiety. The scent poured out into the streets, mingling with wood smoke, giving entire districts the smell of sanctified desperation. But incense didn't stay in churches. Families bought whatever powders they could afford, tossing them over hearth coals to ward off bad air. Some people carried small pouches of perfumed herbs, holding them over their noses when passing suspicious smells, which was everywhere. Others tied sprigs of aromatic plants to belts, bedposts, window frames, even animals. Unfortunately, when you mix incense with street fires, cooking smoke, rotting food, and decaying flesh, you get a scent that defies accurate description. If you tried to paint it, you'd use the darkest colours. If you tried to write it, you'd run out of synonyms for overwhelming. Then came the latrines, which added their own contribution. With so many people sick, latrines overflowed, sewers backed up, and chamber pot contents became increasingly difficult to dispose of discreetly. The streets themselves absorbed some of this burden, unwillingly but consistently. Rain helped occasionally, washing everything down the nearest slope, but rain also stirred the smells like a spoon in a bowl, lifting them into the air before redistributing them evenly across the city. Even food smells changed. With markets disrupted and supplies scarce, cooking shifted from hearty stews and roasted meats to thin broths, burnt scraps, and whatever ingredients families managed to salvage. The once pleasant scent of dinner became a thin, smoky whisper of survival. Houses no longer smelled of cooking, they smelled of effort. The living contributed their own layer to the sensory landscape. Sick bodies produced odours tied to fever, sweat, infection, and fear. People weakened by plague rarely bathed. They lay in beds damp with perspiration, blankets unwashed, linens unchanged. Medical treatments didn't help. Vinegar oils and poultices created pungent mixtures that clung to patients and caregivers alike. Even the breath of the dying carried a sweetness that physicians recognized instantly and feared deeply. Animals added another dimension. Horses, goats, dogs, and chickens lived close to humans, leaving trails of scent everywhere they went. When owners died, animals wandered freely, adding to the chaos. Abandoned livestock roamed streets, leaving reminders of their presence wherever instinct dictated. Sometimes those reminders mixed with less pleasant discoveries, resulting in a smell strong enough to make the most hardened city dweller question their continued will to live in an urban environment. And yet, amidst all of this, life continued. People adapted. They recognized plague by smell long before symptoms appeared. Streets developed reputations based on their scent profiles. Some families moved their sleeping areas to higher floors, believing the air upstairs was cleaner. Others hung cloth soaked in vinegar over doorways, praying it would act as a barrier. Nothing fully worked, but humans are stubborn survivors. They endured even as the city became a tapestry of competing odours, each one telling a story. If sight showed the plague's reach, smell showed its depth, and your nose, assaulted daily, learned things it could never forget. In a medieval plague city, children were not shielded from suffering, they were submerged in it. Childhood, already a fragile and fleeting stage in medieval life, became even more precarious when the plague arrived. In many cases, childhood ended early, if it started at all. Plague did not distinguish between age groups. Children fell ill as readily as adults, often faster. Their bodies, smaller and still developing, struggled to endure the violent fevers and swelling that the disease brought. Parents watched helplessly as once lively children weakened in days or hours. The frantic tenderness of caregiving collided with the brutal reality that nothing seemed to help. Yet mortality was only one part of the story. The plague also reshaped the daily experiences of children who survived, experiences marked by loss, responsibility, and fear. First, there were orphans, an ever-growing population. As death swept through households, children awoke to silence where once there had been voices. Neighbours sometimes stepped in to help, but panic made people cautious. A child was not just a grieving survivor, they were a potential carrier of death. Some people took orphans in out of compassion or duty, others avoided them entirely, believing misfortune clung to families touched by plague. Cities attempted to address the crisis. Some churches organised food for orphans, some wealthier citizens left small allowances in wills. But the sheer number of parentless children overwhelmed every system. Small groups of children wandered the streets, clutching younger siblings, searching for relatives who might already be gone. Older children, barely more than children themselves, became caretakers overnight. Abandonment, too, became heartbreakingly common. Not because parents didn't love their children, but because terror and desperation pushed families to impossible decisions. A child showing early symptoms might be left outside a church, in the belief that divine intervention offered a better chance than remaining in a household where the plague raged. Infants were found swaddled on doorsteps. Toddlers cried outside shuttered homes, banging on the wood for a father or mother who could no longer answer. Those who survived without illness faced a different kind of burden: labour. When adults fell sick or died, tasks once reserved for grown bodies fell to small hands. Children fetched water, an unbearable chore even in normal times. They carried messages across eerily quiet streets. They tended fires, prepared food, and cleaned what households had become too exhausted to maintain. Shepherding siblings became their new occupation. Fear aged them faster than time ever could. Some children had to find work outside the home. In a city desperate for labour, even young workers were welcomed, grudgingly and with pity. They helped dig graves, carried bundles, swept streets, or assisted in workshops where apprentices had died. Nobody asked them whether the tools were too heavy or the work too grim. The city needed hands, their small ones would do. Yet amid this hardship, children displayed a kind of resilience adults envied. They adapted quickly. They formed small alliances, looking after one another the way only children can, fiercely, instinctively, even when they barely understood what danger meant. They created routines to cope, whispering stories at night, sharing scraps of food, inventing new games from discarded objects. Even in tragedy, a child's instinct to play flickered, briefly but beautifully. But the games themselves changed. Instead of pretending to be knights, some children acted out funerals. Instead of mock battles, they recreated processions they'd watched from doorsteps. Instead of chasing each other through markets, they chased the fleeting sense of normalcy. Their play mirrored the world around them, reflecting what they saw but did not yet have words for. Fear shaped them. They learned to recognize danger not through lectures, but through lived experience. The look in adults' eyes, the sudden quiet in a home, the way neighbours crossed themselves before knocking on a door. They learned to check on siblings during the night. They learned to listen for coughing. They learned to exist in a world where the future was uncertain and tomorrow was something earned, not promised. Some children assumed roles far beyond their age. A girl of 9 might nurse her mother. A boy of 7 might become the man of the house after his father died, trying to imitate responsibilities he did not understand. They became protectors, caregivers, scouts and mourners, all before losing their baby teeth. And then, of course, there were the children who somehow avoided sickness entirely, becoming the smallest survivors of a disaster they never asked to endure. These children grew up with memories sharper than the adults expected. They remembered the smell of smoke, the silence of the streets, the shape of fear in their parents' faces. They remembered how quickly life changed. They remembered the names of those who vanished. Years later, they would be the ones telling stories of the plague, stories with details only a child could have observed. They grew into adults shaped not by the world as it should have been, but by the world as it was, unpredictable, fragile, and entirely beyond their control. But they survived. Not gracefully, not easily, and not without scars, but they survived. Childhood ended early, if it started at all. But even in the darkest season, some children found ways to endure, adapt, and carry their memories into the world beyond the plague. In a medieval plague city, wealth could buy many things: spices, luxuries, warm homes, silk clothing, servants to handle unpleasant tasks, and enough social distance to make you feel special. What it could not buy, despite every desperate attempt, was immunity. Money bought comfort, not immunity. And during the plague, comfort had the approximate lifespan of a candle in a windstorm. The wealthy did have advantages, and they used them immediately. The moment plague rumours stirred, nobles and merchants packed carts, loaded horses, summoned servants, and fled to country estates. Flight was the luxury of the privileged. The poor had nowhere to go except the homes where they were already infected. These aristocratic escapes became spectacles, elegant carriages rolling out of the city while behind them smoke and fear drifted through the streets. Even clergy noticed. When the rich run, some muttered, the rest of us remain for the consequences, but privilege came with speed, and the wealthy rarely stayed long enough to watch the situation unfold. Those who remained in the city lived in larger houses, with more rooms and better ventilation than the modest dwellings of the poor. They could isolate family members more effectively, avoid crowded sleeping conditions, and store food privately. They had servants to fetch water and supplies, reducing exposure. They had access to herbs, spices, and expensive treatments, none of which cured plague, but all of which felt reassuring. Their diets, though still limited by supply shortages, contained fresher ingredients and safer preparation methods. Their clothing was washed more often, their linens were cleaner, their homes smelled less like desperation and more like an attempt at optimism. But plague is famously unimpressed by social status. Once the disease entered a wealthy household, it spread with the same ruthless efficiency. Rich lungs contracted the same fevers, rich bodies succumbed to the same swellings. Rich families experienced the same terror when a cough echoed down a corridor, and although they had more space to hide from each other, plague needed only one infected servant, one contaminated cloth, or one unlucky breath to break through all their precautions. In fact, the wealthy were often at more danger than they realized. Many noble families maintained large staffs: maids, cooks, footmen, gardeners, guards, tutors, wet nurses, stable hands, and errand boys. Their homes functioned like miniature communities. The more people under one roof, the more pathways for infection. Servants, frequently overworked and underrested, were exposed earlier and more often than their employers. They fetched supplies from the market, collected food from vendors, carried letters and delivered goods. They slipped into alleys and courtyards where sickness lingered. They returned home exhausted, coughing or feverish. And because servants lived where they worked, disease walked straight through the front door. The wealthy responded by tightening control, mandating strict protocols they believed would protect them. Servants were forbidden to leave the house. Deliveries were inspected. Letters were smoked in herbal fusel fumes. Clothing was beaten and aired out daily. Some families forced new servants to quarantine upon arrival, an idea sound in theory but devastating in practice. Servants trapped in these systems bore the heaviest burden. If plague entered the home, it was the servants who nursed the sick, lifted water, changed bedding, cleaned messes, and disposed of linens, all without medical protection. And because their living quarters were smaller and more crowded, once illness began among the staff, it consumed them quickly. The wealthy, meanwhile, isolated themselves behind closed doors, whispering prayers and ignoring the rising silence among their employees. They lived in fewer crowds, but also in greater denial. The middle class, small but present, walked a strange tightrope. Merchants, artisans, and minor officials had enough resources to attempt safety, but not enough to guarantee it. They could afford precautions, herbs, strengthened doors, extra food, yet were still required to interact with the public. They visited markets, they met clients, they managed shops and workshops. Their lives balanced between economic necessity and mortal risk. Many held on to their livelihoods out of pride or obligation, only to lose both when illness arrived. For the poor, plague was not an invader, it was a neighbour. Their homes were small, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Entire families shared a single room, breathing the same air, sleeping on shared straw wrapped in the same blankets. When one person fell ill, the rest followed quickly. They had no option to flee, no savings to stockpile food, no servants to shield them, no spare rooms for isolation. They fetched their own water, waited in long lines for bread, bargained in cramped marketplaces, walked through the busiest streets, and worked jobs that required constant proximity to others. In their world, plague was not a crisis, it was a second job. Yet the poor possessed something the wealthy lacked: experience with hardship. They adapted faster, they rationed instinctively, they supported neighbours with what little they had, they comforted children with calm born from a lifetime of uncertainty. Meanwhile, wealthy families, unaccustomed to fear, panicked dramatically. Some barricaded themselves so tightly inside their estates that their first real threat became starvation. Others abandoned sick relatives inside locked rooms, too afraid to help. A few became paranoid, suspecting servants, neighbours, or even family members of bringing illness inside intentionally. Status offered no immunity. Wealth extended your timeline but not your chances. And when the plague finally receded, the city recorded losses indiscriminately. Noble houses fell empty, merchant families vanished. Entire poor districts hollowed out, grave markers did not list income, death spared whom it pleased. Wealth didn't save you, it just delayed things, and when fate eventually caught up, it never asked to see your bank records. When plague turned the medieval city into a labyrinth of danger, despair, and steadily vanishing neighbours, one idea rose above all others: leave, get out, escape, flee to the countryside where the air was cleaner, the streets were wider, and death, supposedly, had not yet memorised everyone's address. Running away helped, unless you brought the plague with you. But leaving the city was not as simple as packing a bag and heading for the gate. Medieval escape attempts were improvisational, risky, and often ironic. You might survive the plague only to die from the attempt to avoid it. Let's start with the logistics. To leave any major medieval city, you had to get through the city gates, gates that were suddenly guarded by men who had discovered, very recently, that they enjoyed saying no. If authorities suspected travellers came from infected districts, guards denied passage. Sometimes they allowed people out but barred them from coming back. Sometimes they allowed nobody out at all. and sometimes they improvise rules depending on mood, bribes, or the number of corpses recently dragged past them. Those who managed to slip through the gates had to contend with the roads, which quickly transformed into rivers of fleeing humanity. Merchants abandoned their shops, families loaded ox carts with furniture, goats, children, and bread. Servants were ordered to march ahead with bundles. Wealthy families rolled through with wagons covered by bright fabrics, mobile fortresses of optimism. The poor walked barefoot, carrying sacks filled with whatever dignity could be bundled quickly. The countryside, however, was not thrilled to see them. Villagers, aware that plague began in cities, greeted travellers with suspicion. Some communities barred outsiders entirely. Travellers arrived at village gates only to be met with crossed spears and the phrase, "try somewhere else." In more extreme cases, villagers built temporary barricades or patrolled roads to keep refugees at bay. To them, strangers were not guests. They were potential illnesses wearing shoes. In response, desperate city dwellers attempted creative detours, sneaking through woods, wading through streams, crossing farmland at night, or following animal paths. These attempts often resulted in getting lost, injured, or meeting one of nature's less enthusiastic hosts: wolves, wild boars, territorial farmers, or rivers that looked shallow, but weren't. Travellers also faced the joys of medieval wilderness survival, which included sleeping under trees with no blankets, eating whatever they brought, which was usually not enough, dealing with weather that did not understand the phrase, "give me a break," sharing the night with the insects who believed travellers were buffets, listening to one another cough and trying not to interpret it as doom. If you had a horse or cart, travel was easier, until the horse collapsed, the wheel broke, or the cart got stuck in mud thick enough to swallow pride and personal belongings alike. Some sought refuge in abandoned farmhouses, only to discover why they were abandoned, because the plague had already visited. Others begged monasteries for shelter. Monks, compassionate but cautious, sometimes allowed temporary lodging in separate buildings far away, preferably behind walls thick enough to protect both souls and respiratory systems. And then there were the accidental plague couriers, people who fled while still in the incubation stage of illness. They felt healthy when they left the city, sprightly, hopeful, confident they had outsmarted fate. But the plague was patient. Symptoms often developed days after exposure. A traveller might arrive in a new village, greet the locals, settle in a barn or cottage, and then begin coughing, shivering, and swelling. By the time anyone realised the truth, the damage was done. This tragic pattern repeated across regions. People fleeing for safety unintentionally became the very thing others were trying to avoid. Plague travelled not on maps, but on people, carried by those who believed movement equaled survival. And so what began as a city's crisis slowly spread outward, carried by feet, hooves, carts, and human hope. For those fortunate enough to reach their destination without incident, life outside the city still wasn't comfortable. Refugees slept in barns, sheds, hayfields, or beneath wagons. Food was scarce and hospitality was thin. Generosity fades when famine and fear are constant companions. Some displaced families formed temporary camps near rivers, creating small, fragile communities held together by necessity. Meanwhile, many nobles who fled to country estates discovered that isolation came with unexpected challenges. Estates required workers, most of whom had stayed behind. No servants meant no fires, no bread, no repairs, no water hauled from wells. Privileged refugees often found themselves trying to perform labour they had never done in their lives, fetching fuel, tending animals, mending walls. Some adapted with impressive speed. Others re-evaluated every decision that had led them to flee a city where they used to have staff. But the greatest irony was this: the further people fled, the more they realised that plague did not respect geography. It reached towns days after refugees arrived. It followed roads, markets, and trade routes. It slipped across borders with the ease of a rumour. In many places, the countryside became unsafe shortly after the city did. And so, some travellers turned around. They returned to the city they had abandoned, hoping the worst had passed. Sometimes they were right. More often the city was now quieter, emptier, and sadder than when they left. For those who stayed on the road, life became a long waiting game, waiting for news, waiting for safety, waiting for the world to stop collapsing. Leaving the city was a gamble with stakes as high as staying. Running away helped, unless you brought the plague with you. And since nobody knew who carried it until it was too late, every traveller became both victim and vector, fearing the very footsteps that carried them forward. If you lived in a medieval plague city, your life expectancy didn't merely decline, it plummeted with the enthusiasm of someone tripping down a very long staircase. One day you were going about your life, trying not to step in questionable puddles, and the next you were calculating your odds like a gambler who suddenly realised the house doesn't play fair. Understanding how long the average person lasted requires examining plague survival not as a single number, but as a spectrum shaped by exposure, timing, luck, and sheer biological stubbornness. Let's start with the most common experience, those who didn't last long at all. Once symptoms appeared, the clock began ticking loudly. Medieval plague progressed rapidly. Fever, swelling, delirium, and collapse often unfolded within a matter of days. For many, it was not a lingering illness, but a brutal sprint toward the inevitable. People went to bed with a headache and woke up with a fate. Neighbours saw each other on Tuesday and attended their funerals by Friday, if funerals were even occurring at that stage. The typical survival timeline for the bubonic form was 2 to 7 days after symptoms emerged. 2 if your luck was bad, 7 if your luck was suspiciously good. Families barely had time to comprehend what was happening before the disease claimed another victim. The speed of decline stunned even hardened medieval minds accustomed to short lives and dangerous times. But the timeline wasn't measured only in days after infection. Another critical variable was when you encountered the plague. Early in an outbreak, when rumours whispered through alleys and only a few houses showed symptoms, survival odds were better. Not because the disease was gentler, but because the city hadn't yet become a hostile environment. Food was available, streets were functional, caregivers were still alive, thus, emotionally, people could still muster energy to fight. As weeks passed, however, the city changed. Markets thinned, labour shortages grew, and the emotional stamina of the entire population drained away. By the midpoint of an outbreak, surviving long enough to fall sick became a risk in itself. Scarcity, stress, and weakened communities made non-plague dangers more deadly. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, worsening living conditions. People didn't just battle plague, they battled 1,000 invisible consequences of it. Some, an astonishing number in fact, never lived long enough to face infection directly. They succumbed to secondary dangers created by the crisis, starvation from disrupted food chains, accidents caused by panic or exhaustion, or untreated medical conditions that normally would have been survivable. In the cruel arithmetic of plague life, every weakened moment reduced your overall timeline. Yet here's where the story gets complicated. Some people lasted months, not because they were healthier, smarter, or morally superior, though many believe that last one. They survived because of circumstance. These were the people who lived in households that avoided the initial infection wave, worked jobs that did not require close human contact naturally, had stronger immune responses, avoided infected markets or alleyways by pure accident, or simply benefited from geography, timing, or luck. So statistically unreasonable it should have been illegal. Survival often had nothing to do with knowledge, preparation, or purity. It was a messy equation in which luck was the main variable and everyone else was quietly failing math. Within homes, survival timelines varied widely. In families of 5 or 6, disease could move through the household in a pattern so eerie it felt planned. One person fell ill, then another, each a few days apart. Some families collapsed entirely within a single fortnight. Others endured wave after wave for months, each member living uneasily under the awareness that their turn might be next. But the most heartbreaking stories came from those who survived the disease but not the aftermath. They lasted long enough to watch their households collapse, long enough to bury loved ones, long enough to see the city around them buckle under grief. And then, weakened by exhaustion, fear, and deprivation, they finally succumbed to something else entirely. They outlived the plague's first blow, only to be undone by its aftershocks. Many medieval chroniclers estimated that during peak outbreaks, average survival in the city, counting both the infected and the uninfected, dropped to a matter of weeks. Not long enough to plan, not long enough to adjust, just long enough to understand that life had fundamentally changed. And yet, despite all this, survival did happen. A surprising number of people, perhaps 1/3 or more, endured the plague's worst and lived. Their survival timelines stretched across months of terror. They stayed indoors, avoided markets, burned herbs, prayed desperately, or simply waited. Some lasted because they isolated early. Some lasted because they fled. Some lasted because the bacteria, through quirks of biology, didn't kill them. These survivors described living through the outbreak as existing in suspended time. Days blurred. Weeks felt heavy. Seasons passed unnoticed. Moments stretched into eternity. And then, suddenly, the plague was gone. Silence replaced the coughing. Bells rang not for death but for relief. Doors reopened, streets reawakened, and the survivors walked out different than they had entered. Shaken, hollowed, older than their years. The average person lasted only days once infected. The average uninfected person lasted only weeks before fate tested them. And the average survivor lasted months, but at great cost. Life expectancy didn't drop. It fell down the stairs, rolled through the basement, and kept going until it found a new, unpleasant equilibrium. There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't scream, doesn't sprint, doesn't shake you by the shoulders. It simply sits beside you day after day until you stop remembering what life felt like without it. In a medieval plague city, fear wasn't dramatic, it was routine. It woke when you woke, followed you through your day, and lay down beside you at night. It was the most loyal companion you never wanted. To understand the mental toll of the plague, you must imagine a world in which waiting to die became a daily activity. Not in a philosophical sense, but in the most literal terms possible. Every cough, every headache, every chill was suspect. Every noise in the night carried meaning. Every whisper from next door hinted at danger. The entire city became a place where survival felt less like a certainty and more like a fragile rumour. The first layer of psychological strain was anxiety, a constant background hum that grew louder as the plague spread. People lived in a state of hyper-awareness. They monitored themselves obsessively, checking their glands, touching their foreheads, evaluating the meaning of every bodily sensation. Was that twinge harmless? Was that warmth a fever? Was that ache the beginning of the end? Anxiety changed how people behaved. They moved differently, hesitant, watchful. They spoke differently, quieter, as if loud voices might attract misfortune. Even laughter, when it appeared, was short and nervous, like someone checking a room for exits before entertaining joy. Then there was anticipatory grief, a heavy, suffocating fear, not of your own death, but of losing the people you loved. Parents watched children with desperate eyes. Spouses listened to each other breathe at night, terrified that the rhythm might change. Friends greeted one another with relief because each meeting was a surprise, proof that both had survived another day. People began mourning before death arrived. A fevered child triggered grief long before the outcome. A neighbour's cough produced resigned silence. Widows grieved their husbands while their husbands still fought to stay alive, because emotionally they had already begun letting go. Plague. Grief was cruel because it forced you to rehearse loss again and again, never knowing whether the final performance was coming tomorrow or not at all. Then came despair, the emotional exhaustion that hollowed people out. It wasn't the dramatic despair of poetry or theatre. It was quiet, grey, and constant. Day after day of fear drained even the strongest minds. People stopped talking, stopped planning, stopped imagining a future. Daily routines collapsed. Work ceased to matter. Eating felt optional. Sleep became impossible or irresistible. Some sat for hours in silence, staring out windows at empty streets, trying to find meaning in patterns of light or drifting smoke. Others wandered aimlessly through their homes, unable to settle, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist in a state of constant dread. Families tried to support one another, but emotional strength was not infinite. Those who had more of it offered comfort until they had none left. Those who had little withdrew early, retreating into private corners of their minds. Conversations became repetitive, circling the same hopeless questions. Will it end? Who's next? Why us? And no matter how many times they asked, the answers remained the same. Nobody knew. Yet not everyone responded with fear or despair. Some responded with denial, the psychological shield that kept people functioning long after logic failed. Denial was not ignorance, it was survival. People insisted they were fine, insisted the city was improving, insisted that God or luck or clean living would protect them. They laughed too loudly at grim jokes. They scolded neighbours who spoke of danger. They pointed to small, meaningless signs. The market opened today, that means things are better, and clung to them fiercely. Denial gave people the courage to keep moving. It allowed them to open shops, cook meals, light fires, and pretend that normalcy still existed. But denial also had its dark side. It encouraged risky behaviour, ignoring rules, visiting sick relatives, attending gatherings, believing rumours over reality. For every person denial saved emotionally, it endangered them physically. Fear also manifested in strange, unpredictable ways. People became superstitious, interpreting random events as omens. A sudden gust of wind meant plague was near. A drop of candle wax pointed to someone's fate. A crow on the roof was a warning. Others became rigidly moralistic, convinced that correcting sins, real or imagined, was the only path to safety. Families scrutinized each other's behavior with newfound intensity, desperate to find a reason the plague might spare them. Fragmentation appeared as well. Trust collapsed. Neighbours avoided each other not out of hostility, but because human contact felt dangerous. Long-standing friendships withered. Community gatherings ended. Even family members sometimes avoided touching one another. Human warmth became another casualty, and underneath it all, a quiet resignation spread. People learned to live with fear the way they lived with smoke or hunger, uncomfortably, but consistently. Survival meant adapting to mental strain. It meant accepting uncertainty as a constant companion. It meant learning to carry a weight that never lightened. Yet even in this suffocating atmosphere, the human mind found sparks of resilience. People created routines to anchor themselves, prayers, songs, simple chores. They clung to small joys, warm bread, a story told at dusk, a moment when someone laughed despite everything. These tiny scraps of normalcy kept despair from becoming absolute. Still, the truth remained. Waiting to die was its own kind of torture. Fear wasn't dramatic, it was routine. And routine fear lived day after day, reshaped the mind as surely as plague reshaped the city. There is a point in every disaster when the extraordinary becomes ordinary, not because it is any less terrible, but because the human mind eventually adapts to survive. In a medieval plague city, that moment arrived when death stopped being an event and became a backdrop. Shock faded, death stayed, and the city learned to function inside a world where loss was constant and grief no longer waited its turn. At the beginning of the outbreak, every death felt personal. People cried in the streets, church bells rang with aching clarity, neighbours gathered, carefully, to offer comfort. But as numbers rose, another transformation took place. The city's emotional vocabulary collapsed under the weight of repetition. How do you grieve one loss when 3 more have arrived by morning? Funerals, once rich with ritual, shrank into hurried gestures. Priests no longer had any time to bless each body individually. Words meant to soothe the living lost their meaning when spoken dozens of times each day. Some families managed brief prayers, others did not. Most simply watched, hollow-eyed, as bodies were taken away with the speed of necessity rather than reverence. And then, when even haste could not keep up, the city turned to mass graves. Mass graves were not chosen lightly. They were chosen because the alternative was worse, leaving bodies in homes, in some alleys, in carts waiting for someone, anyone, to move them. Once the ground crews realised they could no longer dig one grave per person, trenches became the answer. Long, deep, mechanically impersonal trenches. The sight changed people. At first, crowds gathered to watch, horrified. But over time, the crowds thinned, not because the sight grew gentler, but because the shock had already done its work. People averted their eyes, not out of sensitivity, but because looking had become exhausting. You can only witness so much before vision becomes numb. Those responsible for transporting bodies stopped treating them as individuals. They lifted them the way they lifted sacks of grain, efficiently, carefully, but without ceremony. They learned to move quickly, to ignore the sounds, to ignore the faces, to ignore the small details that once would have demanded care. Silence developed around the topic of death, not because it was taboo, but because talking about it felt redundant. Everyone already knew, everyone had losses. Everyone had seen the stretchers, the carts covered with cloth, the men carrying burdens that grew heavier with each passing day. Grief no longer needed to be spoken. It hung in the air like smoke. Children adapted quickly, not because they understood what was happening, but because they learned not to react when adults no longer reacted. They watched mass burials the way they watched markets or gatherings, quietly, curiously, and with a seriousness far beyond their years. For them, the plague became part of the city's landscape, like walls or wells or the sound of distant church bells. Families once devastated by a single death now endured multiple losses in rapid succession. Grief overlapped. People mourned one loved one while preparing for the next to fall ill. Tears were shed, yes, but often quietly, tucked into corners of the home or swallowed entirely in order to attend to someone still living. Emotional survival required triage. Death also altered how people interacted. Expressions of sympathy became shorter, almost formulaic. When every household was in crisis, compassion became quieter, not gone, just subdued. There were no longer enough comforting words to go around. As shock faded, practicality rose. People made decisions with grim efficiency. Who should be moved to another part of the house? Who should sleep closest to the fire? Who should fetch the body collectors? What possessions should be burned? Which clothes should be kept for survivors? In other times, such choices would have torn families apart. During plague, they became necessary tasks, performed quickly, automatically, without pause for reflection. Death also shaped language. Euphemisms became common because they softened the constant blow. People said someone had taken ill instead of is dying. They said someone had gone to rest instead of was carried away. Words stretched to create emotional distance. Even smells, so overwhelming at first, became part of the environment. People noticed them only when they changed. A new odour meant a new death and perhaps a new danger. But the general atmosphere of decay blurred into the city's daily identity. Desensitization did not mean indifference. People still loved. People still feared loss. But the ways they expressed these feelings changed. Instead of dramatic displays of grief, they offered small acts of endurance. Cooking for a neighbour, sweeping a doorstep, lighting a candle at night. These gestures were an emotional lifeline, proof that humanity still existed beneath the layers of numbness. And strangely, some people found comfort in routine. When death becomes predictable, it stops surprising you. Regularity, however grim, can feel stabilizing. The mind adapts to survive, even if that means accepting what should never ever feel normal. But there were moments that pierced through the numbness. A familiar face missing from the market. A child calling for a parent who would never answer. the sight of a healthy neighbour suddenly gone hours later. These moments cracked the emotional armour people built, reminding them that numbness was a temporary shelter, not a solution. By the time the plague finally receded, the city had changed, not just in population, but in psychology. Survivors walked through streets remembering who used to live behind each door. Silence felt heavy. Normal life felt foreign. Joy felt startling. Shock faded. Death stayed. And after death finally left, the city carried its imprint like a scar carved into stone. By the height of the outbreak, a medieval plague city looked like it had reached the end of its story. Streets emptied, buildings darkened, markets collapsed, and entire neighbourhoods fell silent except for the occasional cough or the distant rumble of burial carts. From the outside, the city appeared broken. From the inside, it felt worse. Yet the truth, astonishing as it seems, is that the plague didn't kill the city, though it certainly gave its best effort. The city staggered, then kept breathing. Understanding why a medieval city survived requires untangling the sheer improbability of endurance in a place where everything, fear, hunger, grief, and a microscopic organism with a terrible personality, worked against the living. The first force of resilience was simply numbers. Even in the bleakest outbreaks, not everyone died. The plague's mortality rate was catastrophic but not total. Enough people survived through luck, partial immunity, isolation, or random mercy, that when the disease faded, the city still had living threads to weave itself back together. If every home had lost all its occupants, the city would have dissolved. But plague spared just enough to keep the story going. These survivors became the fragile foundation on which recovery began. They reopened doors, rekindled fires, cleared debris, and, slowly, painfully, started stitching the city's daily life back into place. Another force behind survival was trade, the beating heart of every medieval urban centre. Even when plague halted movement temporarily, the need for goods never disappeared. Merchants who fled eventually returned. Caravans reappeared along old roads. Ships raised their sails again after weeks of quarantine. Trade routes were bruised but not destroyed. Commerce acted as a lifeline, dragging the city, limping, gasping toward the functionality. Markets reopened with hesitant energy. Stalls that once overflowed with goods now offered only remnants, but remnants were enough. When the first vendor set a crate of apples on a table, it was more than commerce. It was a declaration. We are still here. Businesses that collapsed were rebuilt. Workshops that lost masters trained new apprentices. Craftsmen who survived were suddenly in demand and sometimes overwhelmed with work. Tailors repaired clothes for families who had lost possessions. Carpenters repaired doors and roofs. Millers ground grain once more. The economy didn't revive instantly, but it revived inevitably. Then there was community memory, the simple human craving for connection and shared purpose. After months of isolation, fear, and silence, survivors longed for the presence of others. People emerged cautiously, glancing at one another as if confirming that they were real. Conversations began in whispers, then grew louder. Neighbours who had avoided each other now exchanged stories of loss and survival. It was painful, but it was bonding. Communities began forming networks of mutual support. Widows banded together, orphans were taken in. Families who'd lost everything received food and shelter from those who had a little more. Trauma reshaped social ties, not always gently, but firmly. Those who remained learned to rely on one another in ways they never had before. Faith, so shaken during the crisis, also played a role in restoration. Churches held Thanksgiving ceremonies to mark the plague's decline, drawing crowds that had not gathered openly in months. Bells rang not for death but for renewal. People prayed not for survival but for relief. These acts didn't rebuild walls, but they rebuilt morale. Architecture too helped the city survive, not because medieval buildings were inherently plague-proof, but because stone and timber endure even when people do not. Houses remained standing, city walls still rose, churches remained, echoing with silence. Infrastructure waited patiently for human life to return, like a stage waiting for actors, and return they did. Humans, as it turns out, are relentless in their determination to inhabit inconvenient places. Even the devastated institutions found ways to recover, guilds, though depleted, reorganized. Councils met again, filling empty seats with new voices. Courts reopened, handling disputes delayed by chaos. Schools resumed teaching, sometimes with smaller classes, but with renewed urgency. After all, someone needed to learn enough to prevent the next disaster, or at least pretend to. Cities also survived because new people arrived. Rural families who had fled earlier returned seeking opportunity. Migrants seeking work found spaces left by the dead. Orphans raised by extended families grew into adults ready to rebuild. A medieval city was never static. It constantly absorbed new life to replace what it lost. And beneath all of this lay a stubborn truth. Cities existed because humanity needed them. They were centres of trade, culture, protection, and social connection. Even plague could not erase the fundamental functions cities performed. Destroying the population did not destroy the purpose. The city staggered, crushed under loss, hollowed by tragedy, suffocating under months of fear. But it kept breathing, not because it was strong, but because enough people inside it still fought to live. When the last wave of plague finally passed, survivors walked streets that felt unfamiliar. They stepped around abandoned homes, past shuttered shops, beside broken fences and empty wells. The silence of places that once thrived felt like a bruise. But the city was not dead. It was wounded. And wounds, given time, heal. Slowly fires burned brighter in hearths, markets buzzed again. Children's voices returned to alleys, songs drifted from taverns. Life regained momentum, unevenly but inevitably. The plague didn't kill the city. It tried. But cities, like people, sometimes survive simply because they refuse not to. When the plague finally loosened its grip on the medieval city, people looked around at the survivors, not with suspicion, but with astonished confusion. Why them? Why anyone? Why did one household collapse in days while another remained untouched? Why did someone who nursed 3 sick relatives somehow walk away unscathed, while someone who barely left home fell ill instantly? The truth was uncomfortable and oddly liberating. Survival wasn't earned. It was assigned. To begin, the most powerful force behind survival was the one medieval people least understood: luck. Survival often hinged on pure chance, where you stood, which direction the wind blew, whether you shook the wrong hand or opened the wrong door. 2 people could live identical lives with wildly different outcomes. One might cross paths with a flea-covered rat on the worst day possible. The other might go months without encountering anything more threatening than a stale loaf of bread. Luck governed everything from exposure to timing. A person who encountered the plague early in the outbreak faced a city unprepared and overwhelmed. Someone exposed later might have inherited the slight advantage of a community that had adapted, however imperfectly, to danger. Survival was a lottery in which no one wanted a ticket, and the winning numbers were assigned by chaos itself. Yet isolation also played a meaningful role. Some survived simply because they were already socially distant before social distancing had a name. Reclusive individuals, widowers living on the edge of town, artisans who worked alone, hermits with questionable life choices, and shepherds who preferred sheep to humans, all found themselves unexpectedly protected. Their lifestyles, once considered odd, became accidental shields. Families with small households or homes spaced farther apart benefited too. Fewer people meant fewer chances for infection to enter. A cottage with 2 residents faced far better odds than a cramped 10-person dwelling in a crowded alley. And those who instinctively avoided crowds, whether due to shyness, suspicion, or introversion that modern psychologists would applaud, suddenly found their natural tendencies rewarded. Some individuals avoided sickness because they fled early, long before the plague fully announced itself. Those who had the intuition, or fear-driven paranoia, to leave at the first hint of danger often had safer outcomes. They camped in forests, lived with distant relatives, or hid in abandoned cottages. Their survival strategies were not elegant, but they were effective. Still, the greatest mystery lay in those who remained in the very heart of the city, surrounded by sickness and yet lived. Here we meet the quiet hero of this chapter: immunity, or at least partial resistance. Medieval people didn't have the language for it, but they noticed patterns. Some families inexplicably lost no one. Some people nursed the sick day after day and never fell ill. Chroniclers wrote about them with awe, as if they possessed divine protection. Modern understanding reveals various possibilities: genetic differences affecting immune response, exposure to milder illnesses that provided partial protection, or simply biological quirks that made some bodies inhospitable hosts. In other words, certain individuals won the biological lottery. Seasoned workers in certain professions, tanners, butchers, shepherds, sometimes fared better than expected. Their constant exposure to dirt, animals, and various pathogens may have strengthened their immune systems in ways medieval science couldn't fathom. What looked like rugged resilience was sometimes just a life spent rolling the microbial dice long before the plague arrived. Then there were the behavioural survivors, people who adjusted quickly, who limited contact, who stopped visiting markets, who withdrew into their homes with a fierce determination to remain alive. They were not necessarily more intelligent, but they were more cautious. They ignored rumours encouraging normalcy and trusted their instincts instead. They closed their doors early, refused visitors, and adopted harsh routines to minimise risk. For some survivors, endurance was tied to community support. A person living alone with no one to bring food stood little chance of survival, but someone with relatives or neighbours willing to help could endure weeks of isolation without starving. Support networks became life rafts, imperfect, fragile, but essential. And then there were the odd cases, individuals who fell ill, displayed symptom, and then recovered, something that must have seemed miraculous at the time. These survivors emerged with a new sense of identity. They had not just lived through a catastrophe, they had lived through the disease itself. Many became caregivers afterward, believing themselves protected. Some returned to normal life with renewed purpose. Others carried deep emotional scars, but carried them nonetheless. Survival also appeared in unexpected places. Children, despite their vulnerability, sometimes outlived adults. Elders, written off as doomed, sometimes endured without explanation. People with chronic ailments occasionally outlasted their robust neighbours. The plague's logic was not logic at all, and when the plague finally receded, survivors faced a new challenge: understanding why they were still alive. Many interpreted survival spiritually. Some believed they had been chosen, others believed they had been spared for a purpose. Still others felt guilty. Survivor's guilt is not a modern invention. Medieval people grappled with it intensely. They asked questions with no answers. Why did I live when my brother didn't? Why did my child die and not me? Why did the plague skip my house but take my neighbours? The city had no explanations. It had no counsellors, no manuals, no rituals to process mass survival after mass death. People simply learned to carry their unanswered questions like stones in their pockets. Eventually, the simplest explanation prevailed. Some people survived because someone had to. Survival wasn't earned. It was assigned, arbitrarily, unevenly, unfairly. But the survivors, however accidental their endurance, became the architects of the city's recovery. And through them, life moved forward, even when nobody fully understood why it had spared them. When the plague finally loosened its grip and the city staggered back to life, it didn't return to what it had been before. Normalcy wasn't waiting somewhere just beyond the horizon. It had vanished, dissolved, and been replaced by something new, shaped by loss, rebuilt by survivors, and permanently marked by everything the city had endured. History didn't move on. It rerouted. The most immediate and dramatic shift appeared in labour. Before the plague, medieval society functioned on a familiar hierarchy. A large population of workers at the bottom, grinding through long hours for minimal pay, and a much smaller group of elites at the top enjoying the rewards. Then the plague arrived and spoiled the arrangement by removing a massive portion of the workforce in a matter of months. Suddenly workers, once overlooked, overworked and underpaid, became valuable, not metaphorically, economically. Entire trades collapsed for lack of skilled hands. Farms sat untilled, mills slowed, workshops shut down because their apprentices had vanished. Merchants looked around and realized there were fewer people left to carry goods, stitch fabric, grind grain, or haul sacks. Labor shortages created an unexpected marketplace shift. Workers could demand more. Wages rose, food allowances improved. Peasants who'd spent their lives in rigid social positions discovered leverage for the first time. They negotiated. They moved between lords seeking better offers. They refused tasks that previously enslaved them to the land without question. Elites panicked. Some governments passed laws to freeze wages, lock workers into old conditions, or punish labourers who sought excessive reward. But laws written in ink struggled against realities written in corpses. Landowners needed workers more than workers needed landowners. The plague cracked medieval hierarchies in ways that no rebellion had been able to do. This shift rippled through urban and rural life. Cities rebuilt at new speeds, guided by the hands of workers who now chose where to go. Rural estates restructured. Social mobility expanded. The plague had taken lives but given leverage. While the workforce reorganized, medieval medicine also experienced its own forced evolution, not because it suddenly became scientifically sound, but because the plague exposed its failures so thoroughly that something had to change. Doctors, whose confidence once outshined their accuracy, faced an unavoidable truth. Their theories had not saved anyone. Humours had not protected the sick. Astrology had not predicted the outbreak. Herbal smoke had not purified the air, and charm-filled amulets had not kept death at bay. A medical profession built on ancient texts now confronted the limits of tradition. In the aftermath, the intellectual world began drifting slowly, quietly, toward observation over devotion. Universities revised their curricula. Scholars questioned established authorities. Some began studying human anatomy with more intensity, performing dissections that had once been taboo. The plague didn't create modern medicine, but it planted the seeds by revealing that certainty without evidence was catastrophic. Hospitals changed too. Once primarily charitable institutions offering spiritual comfort, they gradually shifted into places focused on treatment. Imperfect treatment, yes, but treatment aimed at physical healing almost as much as salvation. Cities also adopted rudimentary public health measures. Officials began tracking illness more systematically. Quarantine, once a desperate improvisation, became formalized. Regulations emerged governing waste disposal, water sources, market cleanliness and burial practices. These efforts were inconsistent and often ignored, but the concept itself was revolutionary. Health could be managed at the civic level. Amid these material changes, perhaps the most profound shift occurred in belief systems. The plague shattered many people's understanding of divine justice. Some grew more devout, believing survival was evidence of favour and dedicating themselves to religious life. Others grew cynical, wondering why innocent children died while corrupt merchants lived. Faith didn't vanish, but it transformed. Medieval belief systems became more introspective, more fearful in some corners, more questioning in others. Communities re-evaluated their relationship with destiny. If death could sweep through the population without respecting age, rank, or morality, what did that say about the world's design? Some concluded that humanity must take more responsibility for its own survival. Others turned to mysticism, seeking comfort in new rituals and fringe explanations. Art, literature, and culture absorbed the trauma. Paintings incorporated themes of death, impermanence, and moral urgency. Writers chronicled the plague in diaries, poems, and sermons, giving future generations a window into the emotional landscape of devastation. Even architecture bore the imprint. Churches built in the aftermath carried memorial chapels, mass burial markers, or inscriptions honouring the dead. Demographically, the world reshaped itself. Fewer people meant more land available per person, enabling families to acquire property that had previously been impossible to access. Urban population shifted as refugees resettled. Rural villages disappeared entirely in some regions, while others flourished unexpectedly due to new opportunities. As the city rebuilt, it did so with a different identity. Traditions changed, rituals changed, even the rhythm of daily life changed. People woke each morning with a sharper understanding of fragility. They appreciated food more, community more, safety more. Trauma had remapped priorities, and the memory of the plague, its smell, its silence, its relentless grip, became a collective inheritance. Survivors carried it for the rest of their lives, sharing stories so their children would understand why the city looked different, why some streets were empty, why certain customs formed, why the world no longer felt invincible. The plague didn't simply pass. It rewrote the rules. It reshaped labour. It redirected medicine. It fractured belief systems. It altered economies, social structures, and cultural practices. History didn't move on. It rerouted. And the world that emerged, still trembling, still grieving, still rebuilding, was forever changed by the catastrophe that had tested every limit of human endurance. If living in a medieval plague city taught people anything, it was the uncomfortable truth that survival was never a guarantee. It was a temporary condition. Each morning you opened your eyes was a small miracle. Each night you fell asleep was an act of courage. The good news, you survived another day. The bad news, so did the plague. By the time the worst had passed, a strange clarity settled over the city. Survivors understood, perhaps better than anyone else in history, that life in a world touched by plague was a gamble, one where the rules were unclear, the stakes were high, and the dealer was absolutely merciless. But reflection offered its own kind of closure. To begin with, survival itself felt oddly unreal. People walked the same streets they had walked before, but everything looked sharper, heavier, more resonant. Buildings that once felt permanent now seemed fragile. Familiar landmarks, wells, taverns, churches, workshops carried the weight of memory. A doorway was no longer just a doorway. It was a place someone had stood hours before they fell ill. A window was no longer just a window. It had been shuttered for weeks while a family silently hoped the danger would pass by. Even ordinary objects acquired emotional charges. A wooden cup reminded you who used to drink from it. A cloak hanging by the door carried a scent you could not bear to forget. A bench in the marketplace marked the spot where someone once sold apples, bread, or fish before the plague swept their livelihood out from under them. Everywhere you looked, survival felt like an echo, proof that life continued, but also a reminder of who it left behind. At the same time, survivors felt something medieval people rarely articulated loud, the guilt of living. Why had the plague skipped one house but devastated the one beside it? Why did one person recover while another collapsed within hours? Medieval chroniclers struggled to explain these disparities. They invoked divine will, fate, astrology, or moral cause. But underneath all these explanations was a simpler truth. Nobody knew. Survival was a roll of the dice, and everyone knew someone who had rolled poorly. Yet acknowledging this randomness also offered a strange form of acceptance. People no longer tried to understand why they survived. They began focusing on what to do with the time they had left. For some, that meant rebuilding. For others, remembering. For many, simply breathing without fear for the first time in months. But closure didn't come easily. The plague left scars, both visible and invisible. Survivors flinched at sudden coughs. They eyed strangers warily. They avoided certain streets for reasons they could not articulate. They dreamt of silence, smoke, and the sound of bells tolling endlessly. Trauma didn't leave just because the disease did. Still, medieval people possessed an extraordinary ability to continue. Perhaps because survival had always demanded it. They rebuilt their communities the way they had before storms, famines, and wars. Only this time they rebuilt with new wisdom. You cannot predict catastrophe, but you can endure it, and you can shape the world that follows. One of the great lessons of the plague was that certainty is a luxury, not a guarantee. The world could change in a breath. Health could vanish in an afternoon. Markets could collapse overnight. Clergy, nobles, children, servants, none were immune to the sheer unpredictability of life. Accepting this didn't lead to despair, it led to resilience. People discovered they were capable of surviving far more than they ever imagined. Another lesson was that community mattered. For all the fear, distance, and suspicion, people survived not because they isolated forever, but because eventually they reached out, shared food, comforted orphans, rebuilt homes, cared for neighbours, and held one another through grief. Survival was solitary in the moment, but collective in the aftermath. And finally, the plague taught that even in the darkest moments, life did not disappear. It adapted. Children played again. Markets reopened. Bells rang in celebration instead of mourning. Smoke rose from hearths to signal warmth instead of fear. The scent of bread returned to the air. Laughter, hesitant at first, gained strength. The plague didn't leave behind a city broken beyond repair. It left behind a city changed, wiser, simpler, sadder, and unexpectedly stronger. Not because plague was a teacher, it wasn't. It was a destroyer. But the people who survived learned from the destruction anyway. As the final reflections settled into the hearts of survivors, they understood one last truth. Life during the plague had been a gamble, but life after the plague was a choice to rebuild, to remember, to continue, to step forward into a world where nothing was promised but everything was still possible. The good news, you survived another day. The bad news, so did the plague. But the plague did not stay forever, and you did.